Romantic Tales. Chapter 375. Emo Shuyao raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "Did the emperor not mention the military power of the Mahist army? King Ding's manor? No. King Ding's manor clearly has more subordinates than King Ding's manor?" Lu Tsongyun's heart jumped. The emperor had indeed mentioned this and hinted that it would be best if he could take it back from Prince Ding. He had even promised that he would promote him to Minister of Appointments. However, in Lu Tsongyun's heart she had no intention of mentioning this to Prince Ding. Compared to the position of minister that he would get sooner or later, it was more important to not anger Prince Ding and return alive. Even though the Lu family had always been loyal to the emperor, in Lu Tsongyun's mind, it was much easier to ask the emperor for forgiveness than to anger Prince Ding. Forcing a smile, Lu Tsongyun said, The emperor's decree did not mention this. This lowly official does not dare to guess the emperor's will. I think the emperor has his own decision." Emo Shuyao nodded and said in agreement, "Official Lu's words are very reasonable. Logically speaking, the emperor has already sent down the edict to demote me. As officials we should tactfully hand over those things. However, there is no choice. The things in I's hands are not convenient to hand over. However, the title of Prince Ding can be returned to the emperor. Can official Lu go back and tell the emperor that whether I am a prince or a Junwang I do not care. In exchange for keeping the Mahist army and the Mo family's ancestral businesses, I can have all of my titles removed. How about that?" Lu Tsongyun's expression changed. He naturally understood the meaning of Emo Shuyao's words. Emo Shuyao did not care whether he was Prince Ding or not. Even if he was a commoner, the Mahist army would only listen to Emo Shuyao. The businesses of the Prince Ding mansion would still only be managed by Emo Shuyao. The so-called position of Prince Ding was just an empty title. If Emo Shuyao wanted to, he could even give himself the title of king. "Prince, please calm down. His Majesty has no such intention," Emo Shuyao sneered. "That's not what I meant." "Then may I ask Sir Lu what's going on with the 600,000 soldiers that you've secretly mobilized at Feihong Pass, which is 60 li away from Ruyang City? In the south, Mo Jingli, Nanzhao, and the Shilling army are advancing towards the northwest without any hindrance. What is this all about?" This lowly official did not know. "Please forgive me, Prince." Lu Tsongyun was shocked. She did not expect Prince Ding to know so clearly about these secret troop movements. Furthermore, he even knew the exact number of people who were present. Seeing his pale face, Emo Shuyao comforted him apologetically. "Lord Lu, don't worry. This time I will definitely let you return safely. The cloth with the imperial edict is made from the best silk, the best dyers and the best weavers. Ordinary people will never be able to touch a piece of it in their lifetime." Emo Shuyao nodded and agreed. "That's reasonable. Then let's hang it on the city gates and let the passing commoners feast their eyes on it." Feng Jiao put away the silk on the ground and looked at Emo Shuyao, asking, "Prince, are we really letting Lu Tsongyun and Mu Yong leave like this?" The generals present all looked at Emo Shuyao. It was clear that they also had doubts about this decision. Emo Shuyao smiled. "Of course, why not? Lu Tsongyun, this person, is smarter than his father and grandfather. He has already compromised so much. If this prince still makes a move against him, wouldn't people think that this prince is narrow-minded?" Of course, Lu Tsongyun was also more ambitious than his father and grandfather. Mo Jingqi had raised such a flexible subject who had the support of such a large family. "I want to see, even without King Ding's residence, how will you maintain the harmony between the ruler and his subjects?" Then Mu Yong. At the mention of Mu Yong, Feng Jiao could not help but grit his teeth. It was not that he had a problem with Mu Yong, but Mu Yang's father, Marquis Mu Yong. This time, although Marquis Mu Yong did not personally lead the troops when the princess consort was being chased by Dechu State's troops, he was the one who commanded them. Similarly, they were also clear about the contents of the imperial edict Marquis Mu Yong received from Mo Jingqi. Under such circumstances, even if Mu Yong was killed, it was a logical thing to do. Thus, Feng Jiao could not understand why Prince wanted to release Mu Yong to Marquis Mu Yong. A cold glint flashed in Emo Shuyao's eyes as he said mildly, "I still have use for Mu Yong. As for Marquis Mu Yong, tell your men to be careful. Don't let him die on the battlefield." Seeing that Emo Shuyao clearly had his own plans, Feng Jiao did not ask further. It was just that when he raised his head and saw a flash of red light from Emo Shuyao, Feng Jiao silently lamented for Marquis Muyang in his heart. Being targeted by the prince, dying on the battlefield was actually the best ending for Marquis Muyang, right? Chapter 376. Emo Xiuyao stood up, the faint smile on his face turning into a solemn and serious expression. The generals who had been sitting immediately stood up in unison and respectfully listened to the prince's orders. Emo Xiuyao gazed into the distance at the blue sky outside the hall. His voice was hollow and solemn. Order the entire army, all the tribes fighting with Nanzhao and Xiling to retreat. Move closer to Riyang. With Feihong Pass as the boundary, I want to see all the Mahist army gathered in 10 days. Yes, Prince. Everyone accepted the order. They did not have any doubts about this decision. Feng Jiao stepped out and asked, Prince, the court troops in Riyang, expel them all. Kill those who do not obey. In the 10th month of the 12th year of Emperor Jing's reign in Dechu State, Princess Ding had defeated Genom of Gojoseon of Xiling and Princess Ding in succession. At the end of the month, the Mahist army that had been fighting with Xiling, Nanzhao, and King Li in various parts of Dechu State quietly retreated, leaving behind the stunned troops and the leaders of the 3 allied forces who were hesitating whether it was a trap or if the Mahist army had truly retreated. When they confirmed that the Mahist army had completely retreated from the battlefield, the overjoyed allied forces did not hesitate to charge toward the rich lands of Dechu State. Even Xiling, who had been defeated in the northwest, did not hesitate to send reinforcements to eastern Chu. However, this time they tactfully avoided the land in the northwest that was completely controlled by the Mahist army. Instead, they circled around to the south and then went north. At the same time, the northern tribes' army on the northern border began to move. If not for the fact that winter was not suitable for war and they wanted to see the attitude of the Mahist army, the north of Dechu State would have started fighting again before the smoke of war had died out in the south. Naturally, the emperor was furious about this. That day he issued an edict to the world. Prince Ding Emo Xiuyao was unrepentant and resentful. He withdrew his troops to Dechu State without permission and did not care about the country. He will be stripped of his title, stripped of his military power, and sent back to the capital for further punishment. In response to this decree, Emo Xiuyao only smiled faintly, then casually crumpled it into a ball and tossed it into an unknown corner. The 100,000 elite soldiers of the Mahist army obeyed the prince's orders and charged toward all the cities within Feihong Pass at lightning speed. The Dechu State soldiers guarding the city naturally did not dare to surrender the city to the enemy, so they rose up in resistance. The battle in the northwest of the Dechu State spread from outside the Great Pass to inside the Great Pass. However, last time, it was the Mahist army protecting the Dechu State fighting the invading Xiling army. This time it was a battle with the Dechu State's troops. Emo Jingqi issued a series of edicts, reprimanding Emo Xiuyao for deceiving the emperor, committing treason, etc. For a moment the world was in an uproar. Then the person standing in the middle of this storm was standing at the edge of a cliff in the stopped Cloud Mountain range, gazing at the empty wilderness in the distance. That direction was where the flames of war were raging and blood was raining. Then there was no sympathy or pity in those calm eyes. Prince Su Qingze and Feng Jiao walked out of the forest and bowed to the man who was lost in thought standing at the edge of the cliff. Emo Xiuyao turned his head and saw Su Qingze's gaze waver slightly. He said, Qingze, is there any news of Li? A trace of sadness flashed across Su Qingze's cold and stern handsome face. He said in a low voice, not yet. Emo Xiuyao nodded and didn't say much. He only said, continue to search. It's been hard on you. It had already been a month since Yi Li fell off the cliff, but none of them were willing to give up the search. Previously, after the 2 people who were responsible for leading troops to search for Yi Li were punished by Emo Xiuyao, Su Qingze put down the matters that he originally needed to handle and took the initiative to take on this responsibility. And they all knew that Su Qingze definitely wouldn't be negligent in the search for Yi Li. It was just that before they saw Yi Li, none of them were willing to accept the fact that they didn't want to admit. Feng Jiao said in a low voice, Prince, these days, Emo Jingqi has issued several edicts to slander Prince's reputation. Shouldn't we do something? Emo Xiuyao said indifferently, before we take down Feihong Pass this year, we don't need to do anything else. But, Feng Jiao said disapprovingly, in this way the reputation of the people towards Prince and the Prince Ding mansion will be greatly affected. I just received news from the Shadow Guard. The people in the capital and many other places seem to have been confused by Mo Jingqi's edicts. They are prejudiced against the prince and the Mahist army. Mo Shuyao smiled coldly and said, "So what? The views of the people are just tools that the people in power can control." Didn't Mo Jingqi always think that the Ding king's residence was a hindrance to him, hindering his great ambition of becoming a mighty ruler? Now I will give him a chance to throw away the obstruction of the Ding mansion and the Mahist army. Let's see what ability he has to turn the tide and achieve his great ambition. Feng Jiao frowned slightly and said, "Prince, then we..." Mo Shuyao smiled faintly. "The Mahist army temporarily stop at Fei Hong Pass. Next spring, lead the troops to the west. Feng Sen, I want this world to be in chaos. Don't they like to fight? Then no one should think about being idle." Feng Jiao's heart trembled. He suddenly remembered the man in front of him with a head of white hair and his indifferent and emotionless words that morning. He really wanted to drag the world into the flames of war, using the mountains and rivers as a sacrifice. The departure of that gentlewoman had probably become a scar in the prince's heart that could never be erased. In the winter of Emperor Jing's 12th year, the Mahist army occupied Fei Hong Pass and expelled all the Dechu state troops stationed in Fei Hong Pass. Those who resisted were killed without mercy. In the spring of Emperor Jing's 13th year, the northern tribes' cavalry also began to stir at the border of Dechu state. At this time Mo Shuyao, who was already in Riyang City, did not react at all. Instead he gave another order. He ordered Lu Jingxian and Zhang Qilon to be the left and right marshals. They each led 200,000 troops to attack the border of Xiling. This news seemed to give a signal to everyone. At the beginning of February, the 300,000 northern tribes' cavalry officially knocked on the border of Dechu state. Nanzhao once again sent 200,000 troops to suppress Dechu state. Xiling was also in a state of chaos because of the Mahist army's decision. However, Xiling was still a powerful country that could stand side by side with Dechu state. At this time, Genom of Gojoseon ordered another 500,000 troops to the border. The troops led by Genom of Gojoseon's crown prince Lei Tingfeng, who had originally been in Dechu state, had no intention of withdrawing from Dechu state. Clearly, they were not willing to give up the benefits they had already obtained in Dechu state. It seemed that in a short period of time, the world had really been thrown into chaos. At the time it was difficult for people to truly understand the situation. It was not until countless years later, when this period of history had been buried in the annals of history, that the meddlesome historians and scholars were surprised to discover that every change seemed to be vaguely related to the man who had supposedly only made the decision to lead the troops to Xiling. People also clearly discovered that all these changes originated from the 7,000 Dechu state soldiers who had died at the foot of Mount Tingyun. On that same day, the Ding princess, who had personally led 200,000 Mahist army to wipe out the Xiling army and plotted to stop the 300,000 reinforcements from Xiling, fell off the cliff and disappeared. Scholars and literati often recited poems and wrote their own conjectures here. There were also countless charming and romantic legends circulating among the people. There were even some who listed the Ding princess as one of the top 10 femme fatale in history. This also made Princess Ding of Yili the only legendary woman to be listed as a female general, an extraordinary woman, a beautiful woman, a virtuous empress, and a femme fatale in history. This war that had lasted for several years and engulfed the four countries was also called the Hongzhou Incident because it had originated from Genom of Gojoseon's defeat in Hongzhou. What circulated among the people was an even more beautiful and legendary name: the city toppling chaos. As for how many stories of love and hate had evolved into, there were even more legends. Chapter 377. The armies of the three countries were pressuring the border. Among them was Mo Jingli from Jiangnan. Even though Mo Jingqi hated Mo Shuyao, he could not spare any energy to target him. Every night, Mo Jingqi regretted being too impulsive and creating a situation where he could neither advance nor retreat. He knew that he had completely pushed the Mahist army and Mo Shuyao to their limits. From now on, the Mahist army would no longer be the strongest barrier and protector of the Dechu state. Instead, they would be the most dangerous enemy. Right now he could not even deal with Mo Shuyao because he could not even protect himself. As Prince Ding, he knew that the appetites of the neighboring countries could not be satisfied just by ceding a city or land. However, he had always thought that as long as he did not have the Ding king's household, He would be able to make the Dechu state powerful in a short period of time and conquer the surrounding countries. However, when the Ding king's household really left, he found that the other countries would not give him the chance to become powerful. Send an edict to Immerse. Tell him that I agree to him dividing the river to rule. Also, let him recognize who the true enemy is. This official accepts the order. In Riyang City, Feng Xiao looked at the indifferent and leisurely man in front of him. A trace of worry quietly rose in his eyes. 4 months had passed. Emo Xiuyao seemed to have gradually recovered from his Wang Fei's disappearance. At least he was not as lost in thought as he had been in the past 2 months. But at the same time, that increasingly indifferent expression made Feng Xiao feel faintly uneasy. Right now, it seemed that the entire world knew that the Ding king's household and the Dechu state had turned against each other. No, in the eyes of the world, the Ding king's household had already betrayed the Dechu state. But he could not see Emo Xiuyao's thoughts and plans for the future. Right now, Emo Xiuyao was more like an outsider watching a play. He sat idly in Riyang City and watched the world fall into chaos. The West Hill was the strongest, so he sent troops to attack the West Hill. The northern tribes were worried that the Mahist army would interfere in the war with the Dechu state. He ordered all the Mahist army to retreat to Feihong Pass. Even the news that Emo Jingqi wanted to join forces with Emo Jingli did not move him in the slightest. Looking at the letter in his hand, he smiled faintly. Emo Jingqi is too weak. There's nothing wrong with having one more person to play with him. Otherwise, when the time comes, I won't be able to continue playing. Prince, someone from Yunzhou has arrived, Feng Xiao reported in a low voice. Emo Xiuyao was startled. He sat up and frowned. What happened to the Su family and Mr. Qingyun? Feng Xiao shook his head and said, no, although someone from the Chu capital did mention the relationship between the prince and the Su family, he was persuaded by many ministers. Also, with the reputation of Mr. Qingyun and the Su family, Emo Jingqi would not dare to touch them easily. Emo Xiuyao was slightly relieved. Feng Xiao frowned and asked, since the prince is worried about the Su family's safety, why not bring them to Riyang? Emo Xiuyao shook his head and remained silent. Feng Xiao looked at him for a long time before saying, the prince has never planned for the future, has he? That's why he doesn't want to see the Su family come to Riyang. He's just afraid that one day the prince, Feng-san, Emo Xiuyao called him and looked at him steadily. Feng Xiao waved his sleeve and said, forget it, do as you see fit. In any case, the lives of hundreds of thousands of Mahist army brothers and their families are in your hands. After saying this, he turned and left. Looking at his departing figure, Emo Xiuyao frowned deeply and muttered in a low voice, hundreds of thousands of Mahist army. So tiring. Feng-san, how many years can I take care of them? Father King, big brother, you were also very tired back then. Not long after, someone walked in. Seeing Emo Xiuyao sitting there in a daze, the person didn't say anything and just stood at the door looking at him. Emo Xiuyao frowned and raised his head to look at the person but was startled. He stood up and looked at the person. After a long time, he said in a low voice, Mr. Su, why are you here? The person took off the felt hat on his head and said with a faint smile, is the prince not welcoming me? Emo Xiuyao shook his head and said, Mr. Su, please sit. What has Mr. Su come for? Su Hongyu looked him up and down and then said, on the way to Riyang, I originally thought that when I saw the prince would either be bedridden or drinking to drown his sorrows. Emo Xiuyao was somewhat surprised and said, why does Mr. Su say this? Su Hongyu smiled faintly and said, the prince has entered Riyang. The Mahist army now controls 5 prefectures and 19 cities, including the northwest. Although it is only 1/10 of Dechu state's territory, it is not smaller than Nanzhao. But the prince, what did I see on the way here? The people's livelihood has withered and the people are barely able to get by. If it weren't for the fact that the Mahist army's area of control is currently the safest place, how many people does the prince think there would be in these places? Emo Xiuyao was silent. Su Hongyu didn't wait for him to reply and continued. Before I came, my father told me that with the prince's talent, you can pacify the country and your military might can stabilize the country. You are definitely not inferior to the regent Emo Lufang or even the first prince Ding Emo Lanyun. Emo Xiuyao smiled bitterly and said, many thanks for Mr. Qingyun's praise. I fear that I am not worthy of Mr. Qingyun's high praise. A person who can't even protect his wife and children, how can he stabilize the country? Su Hongyu was startled. When he thought of his intelligent and gentle niece, his eyes dimmed. Yi Li was the only daughter of this generation of the Su family. Toward this niece who was even more intelligent and decisive than a man, Su Hongyu truly regarded her as his own daughter and doted on her and taught her. Not only because of his younger sister who died young, but also because Yi Li herself was worth it. Then, this intelligent girl left behind a victory that even a man might not be able to achieve. After that, she suddenly met with such a disaster. She was even younger than her mother by several years. Was the heavens really jealous of her beauty? Carefully looking at the man in front of him who had a calm expression, but whose eyes faintly revealed coldness and boundless hatred, Su Hongyu suddenly laughed out loud. He stared at Emo Xiuyao and said, "Prince's actions today, could it be that it's because of Li Er? What an infatuated person. I'm sure Li Er would be very gratified if she knew in the underworld." "Mr. Su," Emo Xiuyao said in a deep voice, staring at the middle-aged man in front of him with warning. Even after so long, he still couldn't accept someone mentioning Li's life or death in front of him. Moreover, this person was Li's blood-related uncle. Su Hongyu looked at him without any fear. He lightly snorted and said, "Prince is so affectionate. This old man wants to thank Prince on behalf of Li. Li Er used her pregnant body to set up this situation for Prince in the northwest. So the prince is hiding in Ryong City to watch the show and watch the world fall into chaos and the people live in misery?" Emo Xiuyao lowered his eyes. After a while, a cold smile slowly appeared on his lips. He faintly said, "So what? Don't they want the world? Then go fight for it. Didn't Emo Jingqi find the Ding King's residence an eyesore? Now that there's no Ding King's residence, isn't it perfect for him to do as he wishes? I will wait for him to bring millions of soldiers to quell the rebellion. From now on, the Dechu state will have another unparalleled monarch. The future monarchs will no longer have to worry about the Ding King's residence and the Mahist army. In this world there are many people who want Ai's life. I will sit in Ryong City and wait for them to come." Su Hongyu softly sighed. Looking at the man in front of him who had a murderous aura, he asked, "Prince has nothing to live for? What crimes have the people committed? What crimes have those who have been loyal to the Ding King's residence for generations committed?" Chapter 378. Ha! Emo Xiuyao lowered his head and chuckled, "Mr. Su, I'm afraid it's already too late for you to say this. Since this war has already started, it won't end easily until there's a winner and a loser. It's said that Mr. Hongyu is proficient in the art of heaven. Can't you see? The world is in chaos, the people have no way of making a living." Su Hongyu said, "So Prince is also proficient in the art of heaven?" Emo Xiuyao shook his head, his gaze clear. "I don't understand the art of heaven. I just want this chaotic world. No one can change it. It wasn't that the world was formed because of the art of heaven, but because of the art of heaven. This chaotic world, this chess game, no one was destined to be able to escape. Then let them stay and be buried with Li Li and their child." Towards this kind of Emo Xiuyao, even Su Hongyu didn't know how to persuade him. Looking at Emo Xiuyao, his gaze gradually became warmer. At least this man truly loved Li Er, and Li Er's painstaking efforts towards him were not in vain. Looking at Emo Xiuyao's calm expression that hid the endless pain in his eyes, Su Hongyu even felt that the words he wanted to say to persuade him were somewhat difficult to say. Reason will always be reason. Even someone like him who was called a great scholar, he never planned on living a life that was as proper as reason. This man needed the chaos of war and the lives of his enemies to quell the pain of losing his wife and unborn child. Just like when he heard the news about Li Er, his first reaction was to kill that idiot Emo Jingqi, but not as if the subject had no choice but to die if the ruler wanted. But, whether it was for the Mahist army, for the Su family, for Li Er, or for the people of the world, he couldn't really watch this man drag the world into a sea of blood. At least not for those innocent people in themselves. Looking at Emo Xiuyao in front of him, Su Hongyu turned around and walked out. Just when Emo Xiuyao thought that he had left, he returned. He placed the thick stack of files on the table beside Emo Xiuyao. Zhuo Jing and the others behind him did the same. They carried a stack of files in their hands and placed them in front of Emo Xiuyao before leaving silently. Ever since Yi Li went missing, Zhuo Jing, Wei Lin and Lin Han, who had just returned, had been searching for her along the river day and night. In the end, the three of them began to appear and disappear mysteriously like ghosts. Both Emo Xiuyao and Feng Zhiyao knew that they had not given up. They often went out to look for them. Su Hongyu lightly knocked on the dossier on the table and said, "These were all left behind by Li. You take a look yourself. Prince, tell me your decision after you've finished reading it." "I'm afraid I'll have to nag Prince for a while." Emo Xiuyao was stunned. He looked at the familiar and beautiful handwriting at the top of the file. On the future commercial feasibility plan of the Northwest. It was just like how Li would say some novel and seemingly reasonable words from time to time. Just by looking at this line he could roughly understand what it was trying to say. There was also a small line of words at the bottom of the file. Li had a habit of leaving a date at the bottom of the file. Emperor Jing's 12th year, October 2nd, Emo Xiuyao's eyes flashed. Li still spent time writing these things while guarding Hangzhou. Seeing that Emo Xiuyao was lost in thought as he looked at the file, Su Hongyu waved at Jing and the others and led them out. Only the occasional sound of the file being flipped could be heard in the empty room. Outside Emo Xiuyao's temporary residence, Feng Zhiyao leaned against the wall and watched Su Hongyu walk out of the courtyard. His handsome eyes were filled with curiosity and vigilance. Right now Prince's state made him feel slightly uneasy. But at the same time, Su Hongyu's arrival did not make him or the generals of the Maoist army happier. Of course, the world knew that the Su family was the smartest in the world. But the Su family had been as loyal to the Dechu state as the Ding King's mansion for many years. If Su Hongyu had come to persuade the prince on behalf of the emperor, with the prince's present state and the relationship between the Su family and the Wang Fei, the prince might be moved by Su Hongyu. And the generals of the Maoist army did not want to see such a situation. In these years when the regent Emo Lufeng was still alive, the imperial house had started to suppress the Maoist army. In these years, the treatment that the Maoist army and the prince had suffered made all the generals loyal to the Prince Ding mansion angry. Everyone was sad that the Wang Fei had died, but the series of orders that the prince had issued because of this caused the generals of the Maoist army to see a glimmer of hope. Su Hongyu stood outside the door and looked sideways at Feng Zhiyao who was standing in the corner. He smiled faintly and said, "Is young Master Feng San waiting for me?" Looking at the unsurprised Su Hongyu, Feng Zhiyao's eyes flashed slightly. He raised an eyebrow and said with a smile, "Mr. Hong, you must have had a hard journey. Why don't you rest first before I ask Mr. for advice?" Su Hongyu laughed brightly and shook his head. "This old man wants to drink a cup of tea. Would young Master Feng San do me the honor?" Feng San smiled faintly and said with lowered eyes, "Then I will trouble Mr. Hongyu." The two moved to the guest house prepared for Su Hongyu. Su Hongyu personally brewed a pot of good tea and poured a cup for himself and Feng Zhiyao. Then he smiled faintly and said, "This old man understands what young Master Feng San is worried about." Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Su Hongyu without speaking. Su Hongyu smiled and shook his head. He looked at Feng Zhiyao's vigilant appearance as if he was looking at a disobedient junior. He smiled and said, "The Su family, what they did 100 years ago, do you think that 100 years later no one dares to do it again?" Hearing this, Feng Zhiyao was shocked. He had no time to hide the astonishment on his face. He stared blankly at the elegant middle-aged man in front of him. He suddenly found that this great scholar who was supposed to be well-read and cultured had a sharp edge between his eyebrows. He suddenly remembered that 100 years ago the Su family, the head of the Su family, had personally killed the last emperor of the previous dynasty and opened the city gates to let Emperor Taizu enter the city. Although the head of the Su family had taken his own life and followed the last emperor of the previous dynasty, he had made the world deeply understand that the Su family was never simple literati who were blindly loyal, cowardly, or had strong character. They had decisiveness and ruthlessness that even military generals didn't have. Similarly, the head of the Su family had killed the emperor and opened the city not because he was loyal to the Dechu state, but because he wanted to save the people who had suffered through the chaos of war and for the Su family which was about to be exterminated. As expected, the youngest son of the Su family, Su Yanli, ascended to the position of prime minister at the age of 19 and became a famous prime minister. And the Su family used the blood of the head of the Su family and more than 70 relatives in exchange for the respect of the world. Su Yanli's life and the prosperity of the Su family in the following 100 or 200 years. If no one deliberately mentioned it, in almost everyone's eyes, the Su family represented a scholarly family, overflowing with talent and strong character of literati. It wasn't until now that Feng Jiao clearly realized that the Su family also represented blood and killing, decisiveness and unparalleled wisdom and strategy. A family that had prospered through 2 dynasties, especially during the change of dynasties, needed wisdom, decisiveness and ruthlessness. It was definitely not something that could be achieved by an ordinary literati who had compassion for the world. The Su family didn't like blood, but it definitely didn't mean that they were afraid of it. Su Hongyu leisurely drank tea and looked at the young man's changing expression with a smile but didn't say anything. No family that had lasted for hundreds of years was truly merciful. Even if they seemed to be and had been working hard, it was definitely not the truth. The Su family saw it too clearly, which was why people found it hard to understand. Just like how they could fight to the death on the battlefield as literati for the sake of the country of the previous dynasty. Just like how they could retreat to Yunzhou under the suppression of the imperial family and no longer pay attention to the affairs of the court. Just like they could personally cut off the head of the monarch and completely understand a struggling dynasty. Just like how they could sacrifice almost all of their clansmen for the continuation of their family. Chapter 379. Sir Su. Feng Jiao drank a mouthful of tea uncomfortably. He had always thought that he was smart enough, but sitting in front of this elegant scholar, he didn't know what he should say. Or rather, he didn't understand why Su Hongyu would say this in front of him. Su Hongyu looked at him and laughed softly. I just hope that this old man's words can calm the hearts of everyone in the Mahist army. The Su family is not enemies with the Ding kingdom. Feng Jiao suddenly raised his head. He wasn't sure if what Su Hongyu said was what he understood. He only heard Su Hongyu continue, but, young Master Feng San, is this really the best preparation? Was this the best preparation? Feng Jiao was at a loss. What preparation? The world was in chaos and the world was fighting for supremacy. Feng Jiao's heart was slightly startled. Very quickly his heart began to beat wildly. Because of Su Hongyu's words, it seemed that something had suddenly pierced through a layer of blurry curtain in his heart. The world was fighting for supremacy. Countless Mahist army were looking forward to the direction that the prince would lead them in. Only those who understood the Mahist army knew that the Mahist army was once the most promising army to unify the world. However, because they were feared by the successive emperors, they were restricted in all aspects. That was why the Dechu state's ambition to unify the world was never realized. Not only that, the Mahist army's ambition seemed to gradually extinguish. And now were they really prepared to fight for supremacy? The prince who had just lost his princess had indeed caused the world to be in chaos with a snap of his fingers. However, that was mostly because he wanted to stir up the world and take revenge on those people that the prince hated and hated. He also wanted to be a bystander. And the prince didn't seem to have the mind to consider the future of the Mahist army. Even if they relied on the Mahist army's bravery to obtain a temporary victory in the beginning, this kind of situation couldn't be maintained for long. Also, the prince's health was an unstable factor that threatened the Mahist army at all times. The original excitement, unwillingness, and enmity towards Su Hongyu instantly disappeared without a trace. Feng Jiao couldn't help but sweat in his heart. He respectfully looked at Su Hongyu and said, "Sir, please advise. Since Sir Su traveled thousands of miles to Ruyang, you definitely wouldn't watch the prince be like this." Feng Jiao didn't finish his words, but Su Hongyu clearly understood what he wanted to express. He just smiled faintly. The prince just couldn't understand it now. Feng Jiao smiled bitterly. Prince has been like this for several months. It's all Feng San's fault for being muddle-headed for a moment and not thinking. Many thanks for Sir Su's guidance. Su Hongyu smiled faintly, looking up at the first star rising in the gradually darkening sky. His gaze was distant. The Mahist army has its own selfish motives. The Su family also has its own selfish motives. The Su family also has its own selfish motives. That one in Chujing. Su Hongyu shook his head, not saying more. The Su family had never been blindly loyal. Not only for the people of the world and Li Er, but also for the continuation of the Su family's 100 years of inheritance. The Su family wouldn't support Mo Jingqi. Mo Shuyao stayed alone in the room for 2 days, not seeing anyone. On the 3rd day he invited Su Hongyu in for a secret discussion. Other than the 2 people involved, no one knew what they talked about. 3 days later, Su Hongyu secretly set off to return to Yunzhou. On the 2nd day after Su Hongyu left, Emo Xiao walked out of the room again. Seeing the man slowly walk out of the room, Feng Jiao inwardly sighed in relief. The Emo Xiao in front of him was still haggard and pale, even paler than before. His eyes were still cold and ruthless, but there was no longer that frightening danger. Feng Jiao knew that the prince had finally truly calmed down. After calming down, Emo Xiao picked up the tasks he had thrown to his subordinates in the past few months. He methodically ordered the various government orders and the deployment of troops. In the world of war, the originally lifeless northwest region gradually regained its vitality. Subordinate Qin Feng greets Prince. Qin Feng stood in front of Emo Xiao, a faint scar appearing on his young face. His entire temperament had also undergone an earth-shattering change from a few months ago. If in the past Qin Feng was a sword hidden in its scabbard, now he was a sharp blade waiting to strike at any time. In the past few months, Qin Feng and his Qilin had left traces in every place on the northwest border. At the beginning, they had intercepted the 300,000 troops of Xiling according to the Queen's orders and burned the Xiling provisions. After the news that the Queen had fallen off the cliff, Qin Feng and Qilin started to fight independently and madly retaliated against the Xiling troops on the border. In the short span of 3 months, the Xiling troops had changed commanders 3 times, and the barracks had been set on fire twice. Even the Emperor of Xiling's Imperial Palace and Jinnan Palace thousands of miles away were not spared. While there were no major losses, the Emperor of Xiling and Jinnan Palace were in disarray. At the same time, the high intensity in various battles had transformed all the Qilin into real battle-hardened elite soldiers. Now at the border of Xiling, the name Qilin was even more powerful than the Mahist army and the Black Cloud cavalry. Emo Xiao sized up Qin Feng for a moment and said, "I know about your performance these days. Are there any injuries?" Qin Feng was silent for a moment and said, "Thank you for your concern, Prince. 3 of my brothers died in battle and 5 were seriously injured." Emo Xiao asked, "Do you know why I summoned you back?" "I don't know." Qin Feng's tone was a bit stiff. They had planned to all go to the Emperor of Xiling's city to avenge the Queen, but the prince had sent someone to order him to leave immediately and go back on his word at Ruyang. Not only was he unwilling to do so, but all of his brothers were unwilling as well. Almost all of them had been taught by the Queen. If they could not avenge the Queen's death at the hands of Genin of Gojoseon, how could they face the Queen? Emo Xiao took a file and put it on the table. He said, "Enchanting is not so easy to kill. Even if you want to kill him, how many lives do you plan to sacrifice?" Qin Feng said loudly, "Even if everyone in Qilin dies in battle, we will avenge the Queen." Emo Xiao pointed at the file in his hand and said, "Take it back and read it. Come see I when you understand." Qin Feng reached out and took it. He lowered his head and looked at the familiar handwriting on the file. Even if he was an iron-blooded man, his eyes couldn't help but heat up. He raised his head and said, "Reporting to Wang Ye, Wang Fei showed this to me. I originally planned to wait until the war in the northwest subsided before executing." Emo Xiao looked at him. "Then can you do it?" Qin Feng was silent for a moment. Then he nodded and said, "Yes. This subordinate will not disappoint Wang Yi and Wang Fei's expectations." Emo Xiao nodded. "Very good. I will leave all of this to you. I will only give you 1 year. I want Qilin's name to be known all over the world." "Yes, my lord." Emo Xiao waved his hand and said, "Go. If you need anything, go find Feng San and Zhuijing." "Yes, my lord. I will take my leave." "Oh, right." Before Qin Feng could leave, he heard Emo Xiao's voice behind him. "Go find Emo Hua. He has someone for you. Emo Hua knows what to do." Qin Feng nodded silently. After returning, he had already met Zhuijing and Lin Han. Naturally, he knew who Emo Xiao was referring to. A cold light flashed in his eyes. He did not know whether he was happy that the woman was still alive or despised Emo Hua for not being able to kill a woman. Chapter 380. Young Master Han. As soon as he stepped out of the door, he saw Han Mingyue walking quickly towards him. Qin Feng frowned and nodded in greeting. Because of Yi Li, almost everyone around Yi Li didn't like Han Mingyue. Even when Yi Li was still around, their relationship with Han Mingyue was still considered peaceful. Han Mingyue looked at Qin Feng, who had changed a lot, and a trace of worry flashed through her eyes. She nodded and asked, "Is the prince here?" Qin Feng nodded and said, This one still has matters to attend to, so I'll take my leave first. Seeing the back of his figure leave without stopping, Han Mingyue was startled and couldn't help but smile bitterly. In the past few months he hadn't been very well received in Ryong City. Although Mo Xiuyao didn't chase him away, the people below him clearly didn't welcome him. If it wasn't for Han Mingxi's face, Xue Jing and the others would have already thrown him out. Han Mingyue had never thought that there would be a day when he would have to rely on the face of the little brother he had raised since he was young. But he couldn't leave this place. He didn't know what Mo Xiuyao was thinking. He clearly hated Drunken Butterfly to the core, but he still didn't kill her. Han Mingyue could even tell that although Mo Xiuyao had ordered people to torture Drunken Butterfly, he didn't order them to kill her. He even allowed him to visit Drunken Butterfly every few days. It was because of this that he couldn't harden his heart and leave. Sometimes he even wondered if it would have been better if Mo Xiuyao had directly ordered people to kill Drunken Butterfly. Xiuyao. Stepping into the study, he saw Mo Xiuyao sitting behind the desk, lost in thought. Coming back to his senses, Mo Xiuyao looked at him with a calm expression. What is it? What exactly are you planning to do with Drunk Butterfly? Han Mingyue could not help but ask. He had already heard from Mo Hua that Drunk Butterfly would be handed over to Qin Feng today. He did not know what Qin Feng could do, but his instincts told him that Drunk Butterfly's situation would be even worse. Mo Xiuyao smiled, looked up at him and asked, Does Su Zuidi think that I still have feelings for her? Han Mingyue remained silent. Drunken Butterfly had not suffered much in the past few months, at least compared to Mo Xiuyao's ruthless attitude back at the cliff. It was a far cry. Mo Xiuyao even sent people to treat her hand. Therefore Su Zuidi also believed that Mo Xiuyao really couldn't bear to part with her. The reason why he still locked her up and made her suffer was because he was still angry and wanted to put on a show for others to see. But Han Mingyue knew that all of this was just Su Zuidi's wishful thinking. Since the moment Su Zuidi turned and left many years ago, she had forever lost the ability to affect Mo Xiuyao, or rather she had never had the ability to do so. And now, when Su Zuidi was mentioned, the viciousness in Mo Xiuyao's eyes was even more shocking. Don't worry, she won't die. At least, she won't die before October this year. Han Mingyue was shocked. You plan to? Mo Xiuyao said calmly, That's exactly what you're thinking. If there is no news of Lili before October this year, I plan to use her blood as a sacrifice to the mountain, on the mountain where Li fell off the cliff. Next year, it will be Lei Shenting's turn. What do you think of this idea? Every year there will be one person, all those who hurt Li and her child until Li returns. Or until the world is completely dyed red. But, Han Mingyue said with difficulty, Princess Ding is already dead. In the study, looking at Mo Xiuyao's calm and unperturbed eyes, Han Mingyue felt that there were countless things she wanted to say, but she couldn't spit them out. Mo Xiuyao never planned to let Su Zuidi go, he already knew. If he was in Mo Xiuyao's position, he would have already torn Su Zuidi to pieces, but he wasn't Mo Xiuyao after all. The woman he fell in love with wasn't called Yili, so he was destined to be unable to watch Su Zuidi suffer. However, he no longer had any bargaining chips to make Mo Xiuyao change his mind. He even suspected that there was nothing that could make Mo Xiuyao change his mind unless Yili came back from the dead. Mo Xiuyao no longer paid any attention to Han Mingyue, who was standing on the side thinking about something. The reason why he hadn't expelled Han Mingyue for so long and allowed him to stay in Ryong City and even live in the residence was only because Han Mingyue had helped Li at the edge of the cliff. But this didn't mean that he would make any concessions to him because of this. He lowered his head to look at the various files on the table. The beautiful handwriting on them added a trace of gentleness to his eyes. The contents of the files were enough to amaze the world. Even he himself had never known that his wife had so many wonderful ideas, so many grand ideas. Ever since she knew that Mo Jingqi and Nanzhao had secretly reached an agreement in Xiling, Li had already clearly seen that the day when the Mahist army and the imperial court would break off relations was coming. So she did everything she could to guard the entire northwest. And during this time she painstakingly thought about the survival and development of the hundreds of thousands of Mahist army in the relatively barren northwest. If Lili wasn't a woman, Mo Xiuyao believed that she definitely had the qualifications to become a famous minister of a generation that would be more famous than her ancestors. But now he was gently stroking the files in his hands. Mo Xiuyao's eyes were filled with tenderness and love. Lily, I definitely won't let your painstaking efforts go to waste. Even if you're not by I's side, I will let your name and I be famous for generations to come and be admired by the world. Of course. Before that, you'll have to watch how I tear the world apart and change the color of the mountains and rivers. No matter how chaotic the world is, there will always be a few places that are isolated from the rest of the world and will always be peaceful and quiet. Yili struggled to open her eyes, and the first thing she saw was a light green coarse cloth on top of the bed and a curtain that was hung up separately. Looking down, she saw that her body was covered with a coarse cloth quilt of the same color. The numbness on her body made her want to get up to move her body slightly. She stroked her abdomen with one hand. Her protruding abdomen with the occasional beat filled her heart with joy. No matter where she was now, at least. She had thought that she would die, but now not only was she alive, even the baby was still there. Just this point alone was enough for Yili to put aside all her hatred and be grateful. As long as she was still alive, there was nothing that couldn't be solved. Gently biting the corner of her lips, Yili pushed her worries to the bottom of her heart. She tried to prop herself up and sit up. Oh, you're finally awake. At the door, a middle-aged woman wearing a floral cloth came in with something. Seeing the person on the bed struggling to get up, she smiled happily. She quickly put the fragrant porridge on the table in the room and helped Yili up. Yili thanked her softly. Using the woman's hand, she sat up and leaned against the bedpost. She said, "Thank you, sister-in-law." It was sister-in-law who saved me? How should I address you? The middle-aged woman smiled kindly and said, "My husband's surname is Lin. You can just call me sister-in-law of the Lin family?" Poor child. You've been in a coma for more than 4 months. When you were rescued, you were more than a month pregnant. Fortunately, this child looks very lucky and has been well all this time. I think little sister is also very lucky. What's that saying again? Great disaster, ah. If one survives a great disaster, there will be good fortune later. Chapter 381. Yili smiled and stroked her protruding belly. Thank you for your kind words, sister-in-law Lin. My surname is Chu. You can call me Junwei. Mrs. Lin looked at Yili and saw that she only mentioned her surname. She thought that a 16 or 17-year-old girl was rescued in a place like this while pregnant. There must be something that was hard to say. Her simple face showed some relief and sympathy. She patted Yili's hand and said, "Everything will be fine. Don't think too much. Take good care of your body. Your child is more important." Yili nodded and took the porridge that Mrs. Lin handed over. She slowly put it into her mouth. Although she had been unconscious for a few months and felt weak all over, even the hand holding the spoon was slightly trembling. With her extraordinary endurance, she didn't appear to be in too much of a sorry state. Mrs. Lin watched her eat the porridge while sitting next to her and chatting with her. It turned out that this Mrs. Lin in front of her was not the person who saved her. The person who saved her was the only old doctor in the village. It was just that the old doctor didn't have any relatives at home. It wasn't convenient for him to take care of a woman, so he asked Mrs. Lin to help take care of her. Speaking of this, Yili hurriedly wanted to greet the old doctor who saved her. Mrs. Lin hurriedly stopped her and said, "Uncle Lin went up the mountain to pick herbs. He won't be back until later. Mrs. Lin knows that you look like a well-educated girl, but there aren't so many rules in this place. You should take good care of yourself and don't waste Uncle Lin's painstaking efforts." Yili nodded and thanked Mrs. Lin. Then she changed the topic and said something else. When Mrs. Lin put away the things and left, Yili had a general understanding of this place. Although she didn't know the specific location, it should be an isolated village not far from the place where she fell off the cliff. She was found by a small river when Dr. Lin went into the mountain to pick herbs. But it was strange that after so long, the Mahist army and shadow guard still hadn't found her. In the evening, Yili sat outside the house by the herb garden and looked at the sunset in a daze. The village wasn't big. There were only a dozen or so families in total. The small village was built on the side of the mountain. There were no rules and they were scattered at the foot of the mountain. Every house looked very old and small. Obviously, the people here did not advocate luxury and enjoyment. Occasionally, young men, young women, and women would pass by the house and smile kindly at her as she sat by the herb garden. This is a quiet and simple village, Yili thought silently as she looked at the setting sun on the horizon. Under the setting sun, A white-haired old man strolled over with a medicine basket on his back. When he saw Yili sitting at the edge of the medicine garden, he raised his white eyebrows and said, "You're awake. Seems like you're really lucky. This old man thought that you would need at least a month to wake up." Yili stood up and respectfully bowed to the old man. She said, "Junwei thanks Dr. Lin for saving my life." The old man looked at her with interest. "Young lady of a noble family?" It was rare to see a young lady with such a good life. "Girl, what is your surname?" Although lying to her savior was not very good, Yili did not want to take the risk. She said in a low voice, "Chu Chu Junwei." The old man looked at her. After a while he stroked his beard and nodded. "Chu Junwei, a good name. It suits a girl like you." However, this old man remembers that there is no noble family with the surname Chu in Dechu state. "Looking at you, girl, you don't seem like someone raised by an ordinary family." Yili smiled apologetically. He said, "Dr. Lin is too kind. Junwei, her family was born in Yunzhou. Speaking of which, she is related to Yunzhou's Su family." As she spoke, Yili calmly observed the old man's expression. She saw the old man knit his brows and nod. He said, "Yunzhou's Su family? That makes sense. Forget it. This old man doesn't care which family you are from. Since this old man saved you, it can be considered fate. Rest at ease and recuperate." Yili lowered her eyes and said in a low voice, "Thank you, Dr. Lin." Looking at the old man's expression, it did not seem like he was acting. The news of her falling off the cliff could not be hidden. It must have spread throughout the Dechu state by now. She had deliberately mentioned Yunzhou's Su family. As long as someone had some understanding of the family, they would at least make some connections. However, the old man's expression did not change in the slightest. Unless he was so good at acting that there were no flaws, or he did not know that Princess Ding had fallen off the cliff. Yili concluded that it was the latter. When she fell off the cliff, she had thrown her last dagger at Genom of Gojoseon. Even her clothes were the most ordinary and unremarkable. There was nothing on her body that could prove her identity. Unless it was someone who knew her, it would be impossible for them to recognize her from the very beginning. Although she felt somewhat apologetic for lying to the old man, Yili knew that she had to be careful. She could not allow herself to fall into the enemy's hands and become a bargaining chip to threaten Emo Shuyao. Thinking of Emo Shuyao, Yili felt like her heart was being tugged at. There was a slight pain in her heart. It seemed that they had spent the entire last year in constant parting. Knowing the news of her death, thinking of Emo Shuyao's body, Yili's frown deepened. "Why aren't you coming in? Do you want to stay out in the rain? Can't you see that it's about to rain?" The old man's impolite voice came from inside the room. Yili raised her head. Sure enough, the setting sun was covered by dark clouds. It looked like it was about to rain. Yili smiled faintly and turned to enter the room. During dinner, Yili volunteered to make 2 simple dishes. Dr. Lin seemed to be very satisfied. He looked at Yili and said, "At least I didn't pick up a useless piece of trash." Yili couldn't help but have black lines appear on her face. Dr. Lin had already sat down at the simple table and started eating. While eating, Dr. Lin seemed to remember to ask about Yili. "Where are you from?" Yili thought for a moment but still answered honestly, "Hangzhou." Dr. Lin frowned and asked, "Hangzhou? Where is that?" Yili was surprised. She didn't expect him to ask such a question. Hangzhou was the #1 city in the northwest. Being born near the northwest, even if he hadn't heard of the Su family, he should know where Hangzhou was. Dr. Lin frowned and said, "I haven't been out for too long. The names of many places have probably changed." Yili's heart skipped a beat. Hangzhou's original name really wasn't Hangzhou. At least 50 years ago, Hangzhou was attached to Ruyang and was called Biang. More than 50 years ago, Hangzhou was officially included in the northwest. It was only when it became a province of its own that it changed its name to Hangzhou. After thinking for a moment, Yili said, "There's another name. It seems to be called Biang." Biang? Dr. Lin's chopsticks paused for a moment. He asked in confusion, "How did a girl like you come here from Biang?" Yili looked at him in confusion. Dr. Lin said, "Although I haven't left here for a long time, I still know that with your speed, it would take you at least 2 months to come here from Biang." 2 months? Where is this place? Yili didn't believe it. According to Aunt Lin, they picked her up on the morning of the 3rd day after she fell off the cliff. How could she run so far? Even if she floated with the river, it wouldn't be that fast. Thinking of this, Yili paused. She wasn't too familiar with the river she fell from, but she wasn't completely unfamiliar with it either. According to history, if she fell into the water and was directly washed downstream, then she would at most be washed to a lake more than 100 li away from Hangzhou. She wouldn't have mysteriously appeared by a small river in the mountains. Lowering her head and recalling the mountains and rivers around Hangzhou in her memory, Yili asked with uncertainty, "This place is in the mountains to the north of Hangzhou?" Dr. Lin gave her a look of praise and said, "This place is at least 700 to 800 li away from Hangzhou. Most importantly, it's all rugged mountain roads. Not to mention the wild beasts, poisonous snakes and insects along the way. Not to mention you, even a normal young man wouldn't dare to go out easily." Chapter 382. Hearing this, Yili was completely helpless. She frowned and said, "Then how do I go back?" Dr. Lin rolled his eyes and said, "How would I know? This old man saved you. Do you think I have to be responsible for sending you home? First, after you give birth to the child, take care of your body and see if anyone is willing to send you back. But I don't think so. Second, settle down in the village and live a good life after you marry someone. Forget about the past. Don't worry, the young men in this village are all pretty good. They won't dislike you because you've been married before. Do you want this old man to act as a matchmaker for you?" Yili directly rolled her eyes at him. Although they had only known each other for less than a day, she could tell that this old man was a strange old man who didn't act like an old man. She calculated in her heart. It would take at least 4 more months for her to give birth to the child. In addition, after the child was born, she still needed to take care of it for a period of time before she could leave. In other words, she would need at least 6 months before she could leave. Thinking of this, she couldn't help but frown. But at this time there was nothing she could do. She could only hope that Hangzhou and Immerse were safe and sound. At the very least, she still wanted the baby to be alive, right? Yili lowered her head and gently stroked the baby, who would occasionally move. She faintly smiled. "Humph. Are you thinking about that heartless lover of yours?" Dr. Lin snorted and squinted his eyes at her gentle and smiling expression. Yili helplessly smiled and said, "He's the father of my child, my husband. And he's very good to me." "If he's very good, will you appear here?" Dr. Lin snorted disdainfully. At a glance, he could tell that this girl came from a scholarly and wealthy family. If she was very good, she should have been raised in a boudoir and lived a life of luxury. Which noble family's daughter would wander to this place? At the very least, this was the first time this old man had seen someone like this in his 60 years of life. Yili faintly smiled and didn't refute his words. "Chiao. I'll take the baby back very soon." Staying in this isolated and quiet village, Yili's health improved day by day under Dr. Lin's care. Yili was surprised that such a skilled doctor like Dr. Lin could be found in such an isolated mountain village. Including a famous doctor like Xin Yang, Yili had seen many skilled doctors. But even so, this unknown Dr. Lin's medical skills could be said to be one of the best. Yili had seen with her own eyes how he helped a young man from the village who had broken his leg while hunting in the mountains. Originally, Yili thought that the young man would at least be crippled, but after a month he was able to walk on his own. Although there were still some inconveniences, she could see that the young man would be able to walk as if he was flying after resting for 2 or 3 months. Sensing Yili's surprised gaze, Dr. Lin looked at her proudly and said, "How can an ordinary person like you understand my medical skills?" The corner of Yili's mouth twitched. She lowered her head and saw that she was immersed in a large number of medical books that Dr. Lin had thrown over. Now the child was already more than 7 months old. After nursing her for more than a month, Dr. Lin looked at her from the corner of his eyes as usual. He stared at her bulging abdomen and snorted, "This boy is very lucky. In the future he will be a headache." Hearing this, Yili gently stroked her abdomen and smiled. He accompanied her to fall from the cliff and lie down for 4 months. Wasn't he very lucky? While reading the medical books, she watched Dr. Lin busily arrange the herbs he had brought back from the mountains outside the house. Yili asked curiously, "Dr. Lin, are different from the people in this village?" Dr. Lin's hands paused for a moment before he quickly resumed his work. He didn't even raise his head as he said, "Are you the same as them?" Yili smiled and said, "Then Dr. Lin, are you admitting that you came from outside like me?" Dr. Lin was different from the people in this village. Yili had noticed it when he woke up 2 days ago. The people in this small village respected this old doctor. It was not only because of his excellent medical skills, but also because of his profound knowledge that was different from the people in this village. No matter what era it was, the common people would always have extra respect for scholars. Dr. Lin's home also had a special study room. It was neatly filled with all kinds of books. Yili casually picked up 2 books and found that one of them was an ancient book that had been lost in the previous dynasty. It was very strange for such a person to appear in this small village where almost no one was literate. Moreover, it was said that he had lived here for decades. Dr. Lin stood up and patted his hands. He looked at Yili and said, "This old man can also see that you are not an ordinary girl from a noble family. These days you must have inquired about me in the village, right?" Yili pursed her lips and smiled faintly. She did not deny it. These days she had indeed inquired about Dr. Lin. However, there was nothing special. Dr. Lin had moved to this village 30 years ago. It was said that his surname was Lin. However, because most of the people in this village had the surname Lin, Yili felt that this rumor might not be true. It was said that at that time he had an infant named Lin Yuan who was still in swaddling clothes. However, 11 or 12 years ago Lin Yuan left the village and never came back. Dr. Lin didn't look for him either. After so many years, many people gradually forgot that there was such a person in the world. "Dr. Lin, have you not planned to leave this place?" Yili asked. Dr. Lin's eyes were somewhat dim. After a while he said, "This old man is already so old. Where else can I go? It would be better for me to stay here and treat the villagers. In the future when I die they can bury me or something." Feeling the sadness in the old man's eyes, Yili thought for a moment. "Dr. Lin, have you not thought of looking for your son? Perhaps I can be of some help." Dr. Lin snorted coldly. "He won't come back. Moreover, he is not my son." Yili raised her eyebrows. She decided to end the conversation here. Dr. Lin was clearly not a person who liked to cultivate. His temper was not very good. After confirming that Dr. Lin said that she would not be able to leave this remote village for the time being, Yili felt at ease and decided to stay here. 10 days after she woke up, a small wooden house was built next to Dr. Lin's house. Then she moved in. Usually Yili would walk around the village and chat with the villagers. Sometimes she would help Dr. Lin with some trivial chores. After meals she would put a room full of books in Dr. Lin's house. Gradually Yili's room was filled with books. Regarding the matter of Yili taking away his ancient books, Dr. Lin did not express anything. No one in this village could read or write. Ever since the child he raised left this place 11 years ago, those books were just left there and no one would look at them again. For the rest of the time, Yili used a simple hairpin that she always carried with her to exchange for some soft cloth with a girl in the village who knew how to weave cloth. In a few months the child would be born. She had to prepare clothes for the child. Looking at the simple and somewhat rough cloth in her hand, Yili felt a slight bitterness in her heart. If it wasn't here the child would definitely eat and use the best things when he was born. But no. Looking up at the setting sun outside the house, Yili sighed softly. The outside world was probably in a state of war. At least it was much safer here, wasn't it? Chapter 383. While sewing clothes for the baby, Yili also sewed a set of clothes for Dr. Lin. Although the old man didn't show anything on his face, he didn't mock Yili as much as before. From time to time he would throw 1 or 2 books that Yili had only heard of but had long been lost. Yili looked at the ancient books that Dr. Lin threw to her as if they were worthless trash and her lips curved into a faint smile. She knew that this eccentric old man was gradually accepting her existence. In fact, if it weren't for the fact that there were so many people outside that she was worried about, living in this small village for the rest of her life would also be a good choice. Sister Chu, are you there?" Just as she was thinking, a young man's voice came from outside the house. Yili sighed helplessly. No matter where in this world there would always be 1 or 2 people who would make people speechless. She supported herself on the table and stood up. The person outside the house had already walked in. It was a tall young man with a pheasant in his hand. When he saw Yili, he quickly went up to her and said with a smile, "Sister Chu, I went up the mountain to hunt a pheasant. Let me give it to you to nourish your body." Yili sighed helplessly in her heart. She raised her head and smiled at the young man. "Brother Lin, thank you for your kindness. But I don't eat much meat, so you should take it back and give it to uncle and aunt to nourish their bodies. The young man frowned and disagreed. How can that be? Even if you don't eat, the child still needs nourishment. My mother asked me to give it to you. Speaking up to hear, the young man's simple face had a touch of red and he looked at her eagerly. Looking at the young man in front of her, Yili couldn't help but want to touch her forehead. In fact, there were also disadvantages in being too simple and honest, right? If it was in other places, a woman like her who lived alone and was pregnant would be a taboo. But in this small village, ever since she could walk around outside, Dr. Lin told her that there were already 2 families who came to her door and hinted that they wanted to marry her. They also didn't care that she was pregnant. Although she had already explained several times that she came here because of an accident, and that she would leave after the child was born and recovered. However, it was obvious that not many people believed her. After all, in their eyes, it was dangerous to leave this place. Even a strong man would not dare to go out easily, let alone a weak woman with a child like her. Big brother Lin, thank you for your kindness. But, my husband and I love each other. He must be waiting for me at home. So, as long as the child is born, no matter what, I must bring the child back to see him. So, Big brother Lin, you really don't have to worry so much about me. Originally, Yili really didn't want to be so straightforward. However, this person would send some wild game food to her house every 2 to 3 days. In the end, every time she went out, the villagers would drag her to talk about these things with an ambiguous expression. It really annoyed Yili. Most importantly, there were some things that needed to be resolved decisively. Procrastinating was not a good thing. The young man's face turned even redder. He was a little depressed and a little flustered as he said, I know. Dr. Lin said that you are a young miss from a rich family. I don't deserve you. I got this on the mountain. You can keep it. In the end, it seemed that he didn't know what to say. The young man threw down the pheasant and hurriedly threw it out. Yili looked at the door. She lowered her head and held her round belly with a wry smile. You little girl, that kid is the best young man in our village. At some point in time, Dr. Lin had walked in from outside. He looked at the wild game on the table and said with understanding. Yili helplessly smiled bitterly and said, Dr. Lin, why are you teasing me like this? It's not like you don't know that I must leave here. Dr. Lin sat down and sighed, I know. I can tell at first glance that you are not an ordinary person. This small mountain village can't hold you. You're just like that kid in the past. He didn't have the slightest bit of heart. After so many years he still didn't come back to visit. Seeing the old man frown and complain, Yili faintly smiled. In her heart she thought that if she had the chance in the future she would help the old man find this Lin Yuan. Dr. Lin looked at her with some regret and said, This old man is not young anymore. Originally, I saw that you were smart and had good perception, so I wanted to pass on my medical skills to someone. This village, in the future there will be a doctor to look after it. Dr. Lin, why don't you pick someone in this village to inherit your skills? Yili asked curiously. Dr. Lin had lived in this village for 30 years. It was reasonable to say that if he wanted to find someone to inherit his skills, he should have found someone long ago. Dr. Lin lightly snorted and said, There is no one in this village who is literate. It is said that their ancestors set a rule that they are not allowed to read and they are not allowed to leave the village. If they are illiterate, what can I teach them? At most they will be a third-rate doctor. Yili smiled and said, It is quite a pity. If Dr. Lin doesn't mind, then teach Junwei. But I don't know how much he will be able to learn in these few months. Dr. Lin looked her up and down. When he got up to leave, he said, First, memorize the book I gave you yesterday. Looking at the old man's back, Yili faintly smiled and said, Yes, master. At the beginning of April, King Li and Nanzhao, who were fighting with the Dechu state in the south, withdrew their troops. The originally fierce battle showed signs of easing. Once King Li and Nanzhao stopped fighting, the south of the Dechu state would only have Shilling Lei Tingfeng's hundreds of thousands of troops and horses. No matter how strong Shiling's troops were, they were still far from the mainland. The Dechu state was vast and rich in resources. In the middle, there were hundreds of thousands of Mahist army eyeing them covetously. Lei Tingfeng also gradually stopped advancing. Although the north and the northern tribes had some friction, they had both won and lost. No one had gained any advantage, so they were in a deadlock. Regarding this, whether it was Feng Jiao or the other people in Ryong City, they were all deeply worried. Once the Dechu state stopped fighting with the other countries, it was entirely possible that they would come to an agreement and unite the various powers to deal with them. In response, Mo Shuyao only smiled and said nothing. Prince, Mo Jingqi must have already reached an agreement with Mo Jingli. Once Xiling and the northern tribes also stop fighting, Mo Jingqi may very well turn around to deal with us. In the study, Feng Zhiyao said worriedly. Mo Shuyao smiled faintly and said, Feng San, the Mahist army has always been a great threat to the nobles of the other countries. Even now, it is still the same. So even if they all join forces to deal with I will not find it strange. Feng Zhiyao frowned and said, Does Prince already have a countermeasure? Mo Shuyao gently stroked the scroll in his hand and said with lowered eyes, Countermeasure. Feng San, what the Mahist army needs right now is not a countermeasure but a victory. Feng Zhiyao looked at the overbearing king in front of him and said doubtfully, A victory? With a cold smile, Mo Shuyao nodded and said, That's right. After so many years, the Mahist army's invincible reputation has long been covered in dust. I want Mo Jingqi to make the first move. Let's use him as a practice. Let the world know that the Mahist army is still the same Mahist army. Feng Zhiyao was a bit doubtful. He rubbed his forehead and said, If the 4 countries attack us at the same time, Prince, no matter how brave the Mahist army is, they will not be able to withstand an endless stream of enemies. Mo Shuyao narrowed his eyes and looked at Feng Zhiyao. After a while he let out a low laugh. Seeing Feng Zhiyao's doubtful expression, Mo Shuyao laughed and said, Feng San, you call yourself smart, but you are a complete mess when it comes to politics. Do you think there will be a time when the 4 countries attack us at the same time? Feng Zhiyao furrowed his brows in deep thought. Mo Shuyao carelessly rubbed his fingertips and said lightly, In this world, there are no eternal enemies and no eternal friends. The only thing that is truly eternal is each person's own benefit. If the Mahist army is gone, who will benefit the most? The Mahist army today still has more than 500,000 people. If they want to truly destroy I, will 500,000 be enough? Who will put in more effort and who will put in less effort? And themselves. There are the tribal disputes in Nanzhao, the small countries in Xiling are in turmoil, and the northern tribes are suffering from drought and lack of harvest. There is also the Dechu state. Mo Jingqi and Mo Jingli. Do you think they will sincerely ally together? Chapter 384. Hearing Mo Xuyao's words, Feng Zhiyao felt his heart suddenly become clear. He smiled with some shame and said, I'm thinking too much. Prince probably already has an idea. Then, the Mahist army will be on high alert and wait for the enemy to come. However, this subordinate thinks that it's best not to face Mo Jingqi's people from the start. Mo Shuyao looked at him with raised eyebrows. Feng Zhiyao said, Mo Jingqi is wantonly slandering Prince. If we face Mo Jingqi from the start, I'm afraid that Prince will be accused of plotting a rebellion. Mo Shuyao gave a light snort and clearly didn't care. He only asked, What is the reaction of the Mahist army soldiers? The Mahist army has been suppressed by Mo Jingqi all these years. They are very clear about this matter. Naturally they will follow Prince's orders. Feng Zhiyao felt a bit helpless. He really didn't understand why Prince didn't even consider refuting the dirty water that Mo Jingqi had poured on him. Even he was clear about the importance of the people's hearts, but Prince didn't seem to care about this problem at all. As if he saw through Feng Zhiyao's thoughts, Mo Shuyao said lightly, No matter how you argue, the Mahist army is gradually leaving Dechu state. No matter how much you say, in the eyes of many people, you're just trying to cover it up. Mo Jingqi likes to play, so I will play with him. He has been spoiled by the late emperor and empress dowager. The world of those who win the hearts of the people. Does he think it's that easy to win the hearts of the people? Don't worry about Mo Jingqi. Send a message to Han Mingxi and ask him to come back to see I. Also, tell Leng Haoyu to come back as soon as possible. I have something to tell them. Feng Zhiyao nodded in agreement. When Leng Haoyu was mentioned, Feng Zhiyao hesitated for a moment before asking, Prince, do you think General Murong should? Murong was also considered a famous general of Dechu state, and had once followed Mo Lufeng. Now Murong only daughter was the wife of Leng Haoyu, one of Mo Xuyao's most trusted men. So it was natural to draw Murong to his side. Mo Xuyao pondered for a moment, then waved his hand and said, Not for now. General Murong is definitely Mo Jingqi's first suspect, and he is definitely surrounded by spies. As long as Mo Jingqi doesn't do anything to General Murong, there's no need to alert him for the time being. The South also needs a reliable general to guard it. Although I don't like Mo Jingqi, I don't want those southern barbarians to set foot inside the Great Pass. Hearing Mo Xiaoyao's words, Feng Xiao knew what to do. Mo Xiao obviously had confidence in Murongshen, but now he still needed Murongshen to stay in the south. Tilting his head and thinking, Feng Xiao also understood Mo Xiaoyao's idea. Talking about the surrounding countries, which one did Feng Xiao hate the most, he would definitely choose Nanzhao. Different from the valiant Xiling and northern tribes, the Nanzhao tribes had different fierce customs, but they were definitely the most xenophobic of all the countries. And those messy and dazzling poisonous insects and ants. Feng Xiao really didn't want to imagine what would happen if they turned the beautiful and rich Central Plains into a place full of poisonous insects and snakes. I understand. I'll do it immediately. Mo Xiao nodded and asked Feng Xiao to leave. Feng Xiao cupped his hands and left. Looking at Mo Xiao, who was sitting behind the desk and lost in thought, he moved his lips and wanted to say something. But in the end he swallowed his words and quietly left the study. Yili walked back with a basket of wild vegetables in the sunset. Her beautiful face was a healthy red in the sun, and small beads of sweat appeared on her forehead. Although she was already well, it was still a bit difficult for her to go up the mountain while being more than 7 months pregnant. Taking advantage of the good weather today, she went to the small river where Dr. Lin found her. The winding but rapidly flowing river was obviously not the same as the one she fell from. It was not even a branch of the river. At the end of the river was a waterfall falling from a high place, but Yili knew that she definitely didn't fall from the waterfall. That waterfall was at least 20 meters high, and there was also the shallow river below. Even if the gravity of the fall didn't kill her, it would definitely be enough to kill her. So, it was very likely that there was an underground river below the waterfall and she might have been washed out from there. Unfortunately, looking at the rapidness of the water, even if her guess was correct, it was not a suitable way to go back. Furthermore, she was pregnant, so it was even more impossible. Helplessly giving up on the idea of going in to investigate, Yili gathered some wild vegetables and fruits that she could use before strolling back to the small village she had lived in for several months. Dr. Lin and Yili's hut was at the outermost edge of the small village. At this time it was already time for smoke to rise from the chimneys of the houses. In the small village there was not a single person to be seen. From afar, Yili saw that there was no smoke coming from Dr. Lin's hut. She raised her eyebrows in confusion. Master hasn't returned yet? Didn't he say that he wouldn't go out today? Slowly walking into 2 small wooden huts not far from each other, Yili's beautiful eyebrows gradually furrowed. There were people in Dr. Lin's hut and there was more than one. Normally there wouldn't be anyone in the village at this time of the year, and, from the sounds, it seemed like they were trained. Putting down the basket, Yili carefully held her belly and walked to the back of Dr. Lin's hut. Near the study there was a small window. Although Dr. Lin didn't like to read those books, he cherished them very much and often opened the window to let in some fresh air. As she approached the opened window, she heard the sounds from inside become clearer. It was obvious that these people were in the study. Yili carefully held her breath and walked to the window. Through the gap she looked inside. Dr. Lin sat on an old chair with a cold face. There were 2 men standing in the study. One of them was talking to Dr. Lin, while the other was rummaging through the rows of bookshelves, looking for something. The books on the bookshelves were all messed up and scattered all over the floor. "Old Mr. Lin, we don't want to hurt you. Please take out the thing. It's useless for you to keep it. Why don't you teach it to us and save us some trouble?" The middle-aged man standing in front of Dr. Lin said with a calm smile. It was obvious that he didn't want to be rough with Dr. Lin. Dr. Lin's eyelids twitched and he indifferently said, "This old man doesn't know what you're talking about." The middle-aged man didn't get angry. He smiled and said, "Dr. Lin, why are you playing dumb? You should know that since we've found this place we won't be fooled by you. You've already lived here for 30 years. I'm sure you want to continue enjoying your old age. That thing is just a pile of waste paper to you, but it's extremely important to me. Seeing that you and I have a good relationship, why don't you help him?" Hearing this, Dr. Lin's face slightly changed. The corner of his lips trembled. It was obvious that his mood was somewhat disturbed. After a long time he coldly snorted and said, What do you mean by this old man don't understand? I don't know what you're talking about either. The middle-aged man frowned. He looked at Dr. Lin with displeasure and said, Old Mr. Lin, that thing was originally my family's heirloom. It's only natural that we want it back. If you keep it for yourself, you're going too far. Dr. Lin coldly snorted. He closed his eyes and didn't say anything else. The other man had already searched the entire study but didn't find anything. He said with annoyance, It's not here. The middle-aged man didn't have much patience. He looked at Dr. Lin with an unfriendly gaze. Dr. Lin, I've told you that because of your kindness in raising me, we have to be polite to you. However, it's best that you don't refuse a toast only to be forced to drink a forfeit. Dr. Lin opened his eyes and looked at him. He indifferently said, This old man hasn't drunk wine for 30 years. You can leave. If he wants something, let him tell me. Chapter 385. The man smiled disdainfully. I have a lot of work to do every day. How can I waste my time on such a small matter? Dr. Lin, if you're still so stubborn, then don't blame me for offending you. He raised his chin slightly and gestured to the man beside him. The man stepped forward and grabbed Dr. Lin. He sneered, Dr. Lin, I'm sorry. Our superiors have ordered us to get the item. Dr. Lin closed his eyes again and refused to speak. A trace of impatience flashed across the man's face. He grabbed Dr. Lin's arm and was about to twist it. Dr. Lin was already over 60 years old and wasn't a martial artist. If he were to twist his arm, it would at least break his entire arm. But a faint sound came from outside the window. The man's hand stopped and he looked at the middle-aged man in confusion. Who's there? The window shook slightly, but they didn't see anyone. The man frowned in confusion. He put down Dr. Lin and walked to the window. He looked left and right before poking his head out. A pair of slightly cold white hands suddenly reached out and clasped his neck. He only felt a chill on his neck and then a sharp pain, and then he lost consciousness. Seeing his companion suddenly fall on the window, a trace of fear flashed across the middle-aged man's face. Originally, because this wasn't a difficult task, they didn't bring too many people. They didn't expect this small village to be hiding a mysterious expert. Who is it? Come out. The middle-aged man said sternly as he stared at the empty space outside the window. Looking at Dr. Lin, the middle-aged man pulled Dr. Lin to stand in front of him. He carefully stared at the window and retreated outside. Boosh. A gray figure quickly passed by the window. The middle-aged man's eyes widened, but he only saw a dark light quickly shoot in. His throat suddenly felt cold. He lowered his head and stared blankly at a rough-looking wooden hairpin inserted in his throat. He stiffly fell back. Who is it? Seeing his companion suddenly fall on the window without a sound, the middle-aged man stared at the window with vigilance. His voice trembled unconsciously. He glanced at Dr. Lin standing to the side and quickly stepped forward, holding him in front of him and slowly walking forward. Who's outside? Come out. The middle-aged man's back began to sweat. Originally, he was only here to deliver things to his master. It wasn't a difficult task. Therefore, they didn't bring too many people. They didn't expect that there would be a hidden master in such a secluded mountain village. Come out. If you don't come out, I'll kill him. Grabbing Dr. Lin, the middle-aged man stared at the window but didn't move forward. Instead, he slowly moved toward the door of the study. Shwa, a gray shadow flashed past the window. The middle-aged man's eyes widened. The gray shadow flashed by so quickly that he couldn't see what it was. Clenching the dagger in his hand, the middle-aged man gulped and retreated to the door with Dr. Lin. Just as he was about to reach the door, the window creaked and shook. The man was startled and hurriedly pointed the dagger at the window, only to see a dark light shoot out. The man opened his mouth and weakly lowered his head, only to see a somewhat rough wooden hairpin inserted in his throat. He blinked his eyes but found that there was nothing he could do. He could only let go of Dr. Lin and fall backwards. Dr. Lin looked down at the middle-aged man lying on the ground with his eyes wide open. Of course, he knew who the owner of the hairpin in his throat was. He raised his head to look at the window, but Yi Li's figure didn't appear. After a while, heavy footsteps came from outside the door. Yi Li appeared at the door of the study. Seeing Dr. Lin in a daze, she worriedly asked, Master, are you all right? Dr. Lin shook his head silently and looked at Yi Li. Yi Li forced a smile. Did I scare Master? Dr. Lin sat down on a chair in exhaustion. After a while he said, "At first, this old man felt that you weren't simple. Now I know that I was wrong. I won't ask where you came from. You can leave by yourself later. It's not safe here." Yili looked at the corpses on the ground and by the window and frowned. It wasn't a good idea to talk in a room with two corpses, but she didn't have the strength to deal with the two corpses. Yili found a place to sit down and comforted the uneasy baby in her stomach. She frowned and smiled bitterly. "Master, in my current state, where do you want me to go? Not to mention the possibility of encountering poisonous snakes and fierce beasts. She couldn't even bear the exhaustion of crossing mountains." Dr. Lin sighed and shook his head. "Do you think I'm chasing you away? This old man has to go. If I don't go, I'm afraid I'll implicate the innocent people in this village." When he said this, the old man's expression became sad. For an old man in his 60s to leave the place he had lived in for decades, it wasn't something that could make him happy. "Is it, Lin Yuan?" Yili asked softly after a moment of silence. Dr. Lin was stunned. After a long silence he let out a long sigh. If Dr. Lin didn't want to say, Yili didn't want to force him. Although she didn't know what Lin Yuan wanted from Dr. Lin, she didn't want Dr. Lin to think of her as someone who coveted his treasure. After thinking for a moment she said, "If Master doesn't want to give it to him, why not destroy it? To cut off his thoughts. He was raised by Master since he was young, who else would Master give it to?" Dr. Lin forced a smile and shook his head. He stood up and walked to the door. Yili didn't move. She looked at the two corpses with some annoyance. If it was in the past, it wouldn't be difficult for her to deal with the two corpses. But now it was impossible. Dr. Lin was old and there was no way she could let him deal with these things. Just as she was thinking about it, Dr. Lin returned with a plain porcelain bottle in his hand. He walked to the middle-aged man lying on the ground and opened the bottle to shake out some of the powder. Then Yili was surprised to find that the moment the powder touched the corpse, it emitted a pungent smoke and began to corrode the corpse on the ground. In less than a moment, the originally burly man was left with a puddle of water on the ground. Even his clothes weren't left. Then she watched as Dr. Lin walked to the other corpse and shook off some of the powder. Seeing that the corpse was corroded and melted, Yili couldn't help but rub her nose. After being together for so long, she realized that her unknown master was actually so cruel. Seeing Dr. Lin calmly deal with the two corpses, Yili was now convinced that her actions didn't scare the old doctor. Looking at his practiced and calm appearance, he clearly wasn't a novice. After finishing all of this, the master and disciple who weren't familiar with each other looked at each other for a long time before they remembered to move to the outer room. Although there was no more eyesore in the room, to be honest, the smell that was left behind wasn't very pleasant. Chapter 386. They sat down in the outer room and Dr. Lin calmly poured 2 cups of tea for himself and Yili. After taking 2 sips of tea, Dr. Lin seemed to have calmed down a little. He said, "I can't implicate the innocent people in the village. I can't stay here any longer." Yili was silent for a moment. She said, "From what Master said, that person is not a soft-hearted person. How can Master be sure that he won't harm the villagers after Master leaves? If that's the case, why would Master persuade me to leave? Although I haven't known Master for long, I always feel that he is a good person." Dr. Lin was speechless. He really couldn't guarantee that after he left, that person wouldn't get angry and attack the innocent people. Otherwise, he could have just settled Yili in any family in the village, and there would have been no need for her to leave this place with a few months of pregnancy. In any case, the road outside was too dangerous for a pregnant woman who was only a few months pregnant. After a long time, Dr. Lin asked, "Do you have any ideas?" Yili shook her head. She looked at Dr. Lin regretfully and said, "I don't even have the ability to protect myself now. Unless I can leave this place and return to Hangzhou as soon as possible." "Hangzhou?" Dr. Lin looked at her. "Why do you think I have a way?" Yili pursed her lips and smiled. She pointed at the study room filled with books. "The villagers told me that you have never left this place in the past 30 years. But they also said that you only brought some simple luggage and a child with you when you stayed here. Those books obviously couldn't have been sent here so easily, so you must have left this place many times over the years without them knowing. And you definitely didn't need to come and go for as long as a few months." Dr. Lin looked at her and sighed. "You are indeed very smart. You saw it from the beginning, didn't you?" Yili smiled but didn't say anything. Dr. Lin looked at her and shook his head. It's useless. I haven't walked that road for more than 20 years. You can't leave now and I can't leave either. I'm old. Yili had already expected this, so she wasn't too disappointed. She tilted her head and thought for a moment before asking, I guess they took the water route. I fell off a cliff near Hangzhou City, and when I hit the water I was sucked into a dark whirlpool, and then I was washed here by the underground river? Dr. Lin nodded approvingly. You're very lucky. You didn't drown, nor did you get hit by a rock in the water. Even your child is fine. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled faintly. I don't think it's because I'm lucky. It's because the person who built the underground river was too meticulous. That's why I wasn't blocked or killed by the rocks in the river. The master. What kind of person would spend so much effort to build such a secret passage? Or perhaps, this village itself is hiding some secret? Dr. Lin was stunned for a moment. He looked at Yili with an inquisitive and dangerous gaze. Yili didn't force her anymore. She sat quietly at the table and looked down at her fingers that were still slender despite the calluses. This pair of hands had just easily broken a person's neck 15 minutes ago. Girl, who exactly are you? Dr. Lin stared at her for a while before finally asking. Yili muttered to herself for a moment before softly saying, If Master really hasn't left this place in 20 years, then who I am doesn't have any meaning to you, right? Dr. Lin looked at her and said, I need to at least know that you aren't someone from the Dechu State's imperial family. Yili sighed softly in her heart. Dr. Lin's question revealed a lot of answers. Shaking her head, Yili said with certainty, I'm not someone from the Dechu State's imperial family. Although Mo Xiao's surname was also Mo, and he had the same ancestor as the Dechu State's founding ancestor, in terms of blood relations they were very distant. If it wasn't for the fact that they had a hereditary title, they wouldn't have any connection to the imperial family. And in everyone's understanding, it seemed that the Mahist army and the Dechu State's imperial family were very clear. Therefore, Yili didn't feel any burden in believing that she wasn't related to the Dechu State's imperial family. After receiving Yili's answer, Dr. Lin's expression relaxed a lot. Yili looked at him seriously and asked unexpectedly, Master, what relationship do you have with the previous dynasty's imperial family? Dr. Lin stared at Yili in a daze. He clearly didn't think that Yili would ask such a question. After a while he asked, Why do you think I have any relationship with the previous dynasty's imperial family? Yili opened her lips and gave a faint smile. She carelessly played with the rough teacup in her hand as she said, Master is so concerned about whether or not I have any relationship with the Dechu State's imperial family. Since you're hiding here, it's clear that you and the Dechu State's imperial family, even if it's not an irreconcilable enmity, you definitely don't have a good impression of them. Since this place is still within the Dechu State, and Master doesn't look like an outsider. Also, from the river where I fell off the cliff to the place where Master saved me, I estimate that the distance in a straight line is at least 20 li. That kind of underground man-made waterway isn't something that just anyone can build. Also, it's very strange to build an exit in such a small village that's isolated from the rest of the world. Finally, it's said that this village has a history of nearly 500 years. Also, the ancestors have decreed that the villagers can't read for generations. I feel that they didn't hide here by chance. They were protecting something. Although it's very likely that most of the villagers don't know, there are still some people who know, right? Dr. Lin couldn't help but sigh as he looked at the woman in front of him. You know too much. Yili blinked innocently and looked at the old man in front of her. Master, do you want to kill me to silence me? Just like those two people just now? After saying this, Yili pointed to the inner study. Dr. Lin couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. Who killed those two people? Dr. Lin shook his head helplessly and said, You don't need to test this old man. I can see through your actions just now. It's still not certain who will kill who. Yili smiled as she raised her teacup. She made her smile even more pure and kind. A master for a day is a master for life. This disciple definitely won't do such a disgraceful thing. Master, why don't we think about what we should do in the future? Since we all want to live well. Dr. Lin glared at her unhappily and said, It's you who wants to live. I'm an old man who has lived long enough. Yili smiled as she poured him a cup of tea and said, The neighbors in this village haven't lived long enough. At the mention of these simple villagers, the old man's hand that was holding the teacup tightly clenched. His expression was conflicted and apologetic. These people, they are all descendants of loyal officials. But after so many years they've probably already forgotten about their ancestors. Actually, there's nothing bad about this. Isn't a peaceful life 100 times better than those people outside? But, if they lose their lives because of those old matters. His heart couldn't bear it. While listening to Dr. Lin's words, Yili tried hard to recall what she could remember about the previous dynasty. A place like the Northwest had been considered remote since ancient times. At least compared to the prosperity of Chujing and Jiangnan, it wasn't a good place. Yili really couldn't understand what the previous dynasty had to do with this place. After a long time a thought flashed through her mind. Yili blinked and asked tentatively, "Is the previous dynasty's imperial tomb here?" Chapter 387. Looking at Dr. Lin's shocked expression, Yili knew that she had guessed correctly. The imperial tomb of the previous dynasty. Yili's mind quickly flipped through the ancient history books. The previous dynasty had existed for more than 370 years and had experienced 21 emperors. Among them, other than the last emperor who was buried by the Dechu state's ancestor as a noble, the tombs of the other 19 emperors were either destroyed in the chaos of war or looted by tomb robbers. Almost all of them were destroyed. However, there was one emperor whose tomb no one knew the whereabouts of. That was the tomb of the founding emperor of the previous dynasty. Yili suddenly thought of something. The royal family of the previous dynasty seemed to be surnamed Lin. As if sensing Yili's gaze, Dr. Lin looked at her and lightly said, "Don't think too much. I'm not a descendant of the previous dynasty." Then it can't be Lin Yuan, right? If Lin Yuan was looking for the tomb of the previous dynasty's emperor, then it was reasonable to say that it was his tomb. Dr. Lin remained silent. Yili was speechless and looked to the sky. So, he guessed correctly again? Ever since she woke up from her coma, this was the first time Yili felt such a headache. The previous dynasty had been destroyed for more than 200 years. At least in the past few decades, there was no news of any remnants of the previous dynasty wanting to revive the country. But who could say for sure about national enmity and family hatred? Although the Ding Palace wasn't the current ruler, at least half of the previous dynasty's destruction was fought by the first-generation Prince Ding Mo Lan Yun. Therefore, Yili wasn't sure if those remnants of the previous dynasty hated the Dechu state's emperor more or hated Prince Ding more. And now, she had obviously landed in a place where remnants of the previous dynasty gathered. But what was worth celebrating was that the residents living here, other than a few highly respected people, didn't seem to know about the change of dynasty. They were obviously not interested in who was the emperor. Seeing her holding her chin and her expression changing, Dr. Lin didn't say anything. After all, this kind of thing wasn't something that ordinary people could accept. After a while, Yili finally sorted out the chaotic thoughts in her heart and asked casually, "Master, do you want to restore the country?" "Restore the country?" Dr. Lin looked at her strangely as if he had eaten something he shouldn't have. After a while he snorted and said, "Have you seen anyone who hides in the mountains for decades to revive their country? Furthermore, I'm a doctor. How am I supposed to revive the country? Poison Mo Lufang and Mo Jingxian?" Yili took a sip of tea and calmly said, "It's Mo Jingqi and Mo Xiuyao. Mo Lufang and Mo Jingxian have already passed away many years ago." Dr. Lin fiercely glared at her and frowned. "This generation's Prince Ding is called Mo Xiuyao? I remember that when Mo Liufang's son was born he was called Mo Xiuwen." Yili now believed that Dr. Lin really hadn't gone out for decades. She seriously explained, "Mo Xiuwen is the previous generation's Prince Ding. He passed away 9 years ago." Dr. Lin looked at her and said, "You know quite a lot." Yili smiled and said, "Didn't Master say that I was born in a prestigious family? How can I not know such a big thing?" Dr. Lin waved his hand and said irritably, "National enmity and family hatred. It's already been 200 years. Who can say for sure? Furthermore, even if the people are dissatisfied with the Dechu state's royal family, would they still miss the previous dynasty? If that was the case, the previous dynasty wouldn't have been destroyed. At that time, the previous emperors were useless and the people had no way to make a living. Even if the last emperor wanted to reform, he didn't have the talent to be an emperor. In the end he couldn't turn the tide and could only watch as the country was destroyed. Speaking of which, the Dechu state's ancestors couldn't be blamed. To put it bluntly, the winner was the king and the loser was the bandit. What does Lin Yuan want? Why does Master not want to give it to him? Since Master doesn't care about restoring the country and the matters outside, why? Dr. Lin sighed and looked at her with a bitter smile. It's not that I don't want to give it to him, but I don't have anything to give him. What he wants is the treasures of the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's tomb. Yili frowned. It was natural for there to be treasures in the emperor's tomb. Yili didn't understand what Dr. Lin meant. Dr. Lin said indifferently, Emperor Gaozu's tomb is indeed here. The people in this village are the descendants of the most loyal guards who followed Emperor Gaozu. After Emperor Gaozu passed away, these people swore to guard the tomb for Emperor Gaozu forever. In order to prevent the younger generation from being unfilial, they also set a rule that the younger generation can't learn to read. They can't step out of the tomb and can't leave the village. Moreover, the secret of the tomb is only passed down from generation to generation. Even the villagers don't know where they came from. Yili didn't know how to evaluate this, so she didn't say anything. She raised her head and asked, what does Master plan to do now? If he finds out that this subordinate didn't bring the things back, will Lin Yuan come back personally? Dr. Lin nodded and thought for a bit before asking Yili, now, the world is unstable? If the Dechu state was peaceful and there was no hope of restoring the country, Lin Yuan wouldn't think about the tomb. Yili didn't hide it and nodded, it is indeed a bit chaotic. They could only see a torrent of water emerging from the bottom of the stone wall. Yili could only hope that the current situation did not require them to dive into the water. The old patriarch slowly groped around the stone walls that were covered with moss and all kinds of weeds. After a while he finally found a place. He then took out a strangely shaped key and pressed it on the stone wall to turn it. After a while, with a bang, a door opened in the stone wall. The old patriarch looked at the two of them and said, you can go in. Take care of yourself. Dr. Lin nodded and said, you. The old patriarch raised his hand to stop him and nodded, I know. We have been guarding this place for hundreds of years. No one has ever entered. After so many years, we don't want to know what is inside. Since the great ancestor didn't leave the things inside to the future generations, we don't want to change now. I am old. I only hope that this village will be an ordinary village in the future. I don't need to guard anything anymore. This secret ends here with me. This old man thanks you for not revealing this secret to the young master all these years. After you go in, there is no need for this. Take it with you. Dr. Lin nodded and said, take care. After taking the key from the old patriarch, Dr. Lin took Yili and walked in. The stone wall slowly closed in front of the two of them. When the stone wall closed, the two of them saw darkness. Dr. Lin lit a match and walked to the oil lamp on the stone wall. Soon the candlelight on the stone wall shone on the bronze mirror diagonally opposite. Then the light refracted and shone on another bronze mirror. In a moment the originally thin and dark passage became bright. Yili raised her eyebrows and followed Dr. Lin without saying a word. The passage was quiet. Only the sound of the two people's footsteps could be heard. Yili observed the walls on both sides as she walked. She had to say that the former Emperor Gaozu was indeed rich and imposing. As the princess consort of Dingwa, Yili had participated in the imperial mausoleum sacrificial ceremony once or twice. She had also entered the former emperor's underground palace. Although she was only at the outermost part, she had never seen such an inconspicuous passage carved out of marble. The dragon-shaped reliefs on the walls and on the ground were lifelike. The eyes of each dragon were inlaid with various colored gems. The rich and domineering aura of the emperor and the royal family rushed out. The two of them walked along the passage and did not encounter any of the legendary traps. In this kind of imperial mausoleum that did not see the light of day, Yili could only estimate the direction and distance they were walking. After an hour they finally arrived at a side room. The oil lamp in the hall suddenly filled the room with a fragrance. Yili cautiously took a few steps back to stay away from the oil lamp. However, she quickly reacted. This fragrance was not poison. It was ambergris. However, it was still not good for pregnant women. Yili should stay away from it as much as possible. Dr. Lin lowered his head to look at the shabby map in his hand as he looked at the empty room. Rest first. You are tired, Yili looked at the map in his hand and asked curiously, since the old clan leader does not want the treasures in the Imperial Mausoleum to see the light of day, isn't he afraid that we will come back and take the treasures away? Dr. Lin turned to look at her and calmly said, "It is said that the entrance we entered the Imperial Mausoleum cannot be opened without a key. And the exit we are going to leave can only be opened once. Each time it can only be opened for 15 minutes. Yili could not help but sweat. "Master, are you sure that the exit has not been opened by anyone?" The term master clearly made the old man's mood better. His expression relaxed and he said, "If it has been opened, what will you do?" Yili smiled and helplessly said, "Then I can only accompany you in life and death." "But my poor baby." Dr. Lin could not help but smile. He looked at her and said, "This child is very lucky. He has been with you for so long and is still alive. Nothing will happen to him." "Thank you for your kind words," Yili said with a smile. Yili relaxed a little. Still confused, she asked, "What did the founding emperor of the previous dynasty leave in the Imperial Mausoleum? And why did the old clan leader not want Lin Yuan to take it?" Dr. Lin calmly said, "I don't know. But the great ancestor had ordered the guards to not spread the treasures. As for the old clan leader, they just want to live well." Yili raised her eyebrows. Dr. Lin said, "Lin Yuan grew up in the village. The old clan leader naturally knows his nature. If he does not take the treasures, then it will be fine. But if he does, then no one in the village will be able to live." Yili was puzzled. Dr. Lin waved his hand to show that he had no intention of saying more. Yili found a place to sit down. She gently stroked her belly and comforted the baby. Then she lowered her head to study the carvings on the stone wall. The empty stone room was quiet. Only the sound of Yili's finger tapping on the stone wall could be heard. Chapter 389. Even if Lin Yuan had obtained the treasures in the tomb, there was no need for him to kill everyone in the village to silence them. Because these people were the descendants of the Gaozu's loyal subjects from hundreds of years ago. What was even stranger was that Lin Yuan, as a descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family, didn't know the secret of the tomb. Instead, Dr. Lin, the one who raised him, knew. Of course, if it was explained by Lin Yuan's young age, it would make sense. But if Dr. Lin didn't want him to have thoughts of reviving the country, he could have kept his identity a secret. When Lin Yuan first came to this village, he was only 1 year old. There was no way he could remember anything. Looking up at Dr. Lin, who was sitting in a daze, Yili raised her eyebrows. "This Lin Yuan." She felt that something was wrong. And that Emperor Gaozu's treasure, it didn't seem to be a normal treasure like gold and silver or antiques. It also didn't seem to be a secret military manual or a legendary treasure like a sword or a sword. Then what exactly was it? Yili looked regretfully at her belly. If it weren't for the inconvenience of having a baby, she wouldn't have minded exploring the treasures and secrets of the previous dynasty's founding emperor. After resting enough, the two got up and followed the route shown on the map. Regardless of whether the tomb was dangerous or not, the feeling of being in this enclosed space was not pleasant. Along the way, Yili habitually memorized the route they took. As a former Special Forces soldier, a good sense of direction was a must. At least, no matter where she was, she never had to worry about getting lost. The two silently walked forward. Yili looked at the increasingly luxurious decorations and frowned slightly. She casually asked, "Master, are we going the wrong way?" Dr. Lin looked down at the map in his hand and turned to look at her. "Oh, what do you mean?" Yili frowned and said, "We seem to be walking towards the middle of the Imperial Mausoleum, which is opposite of the exit. Even if the Imperial Mausoleum did not give a straight path, it was impossible for it to be completely opposite, right? Even if the earth was round, the tomb didn't cover the entire earth." Dr. Lin looked at her and said, "Who said we were in Hangzhou?" Yili was speechless as she looked at Dr. Lin. Even if he wasn't in Hangzhou, he couldn't be in the center of the mausoleum, right? Being stared at by Yili like this, Dr. Lin felt a little uncomfortable, so he said, "All right, I have to go and get something before I can go out. If you don't want to go, you can wait for me here, or you can take a look at this map and make a copy of it before leaving." Yili breathed a sigh of relief in her heart. At least this proved that this cheap master had no intention of harming her. Otherwise, although she was confident that she could restrain him, it was hard to say what she would encounter in the Imperial Mausoleum that had existed for hundreds of years. After thinking about it, Yili hesitated for a moment before asking, Lin Yuan, is there any other way to get in? Dr. Lin clearly didn't want to give the item to Lin Yuan, so he wanted to take it away. Dr. Lin was silent, but Yili understood from his expression. As expected, the saying that there was only one exit was never reliable. For example, it was said that the ancient craftsmen who built the imperial mausoleum would leave a secret passage for themselves to prevent the royal family from silencing them. Shrugging her shoulders, Yili smiled and said, I'll go with Master. What if I get lost and can't get out? You should think carefully. From what I know, this imperial mausoleum isn't dangerous. You can wait for me at the exit. If I don't come in 2 days, you can open the mechanism and leave. Yili looked around and said, I didn't know if this place was dangerous or not, but now it might not be. I'm a girl and walking alone in the imperial mausoleum is always a little scary. Following Master will give me some courage. Dr. Lin looked deeply at her and sighed. He turned around and walked forward. I don't know why you insist on following me. If you get involved, don't blame this old man. Yili smiled and walked 2 steps forward. Because you're my master. I know you're a good person. Dr. Lin snorted. I'm not a good person. Don't pretend to be ignorant in front of me. This old man has seen a lot of people in his life, but there are only a few that I can't see through. Yili pretended not to notice his sarcasm and blinked her eyes. Master, are you praising me? The master and disciple walked and stopped. Because they had to take care of Yili's health and Dr. Lin was not young, they didn't walk very fast. There was no light in the imperial mausoleum, so Yili could only estimate the time. After they entered the imperial mausoleum, they walked and stopped for 6 to 8 hours. They then rested in a stone room for a few hours. They had spent more than a day in there. But the 2 of them had only just reached the entrance of the imperial mausoleum. Standing in front of a majestic palace door, Dr. Lin turned to Yili and said, Be careful when you go in. Don't touch anything you shouldn't touch. If you trigger any traps, don't blame me for not warning you. Yili looked at him. Master clearly said that there wasn't any danger in here. Dr. Lin snorted and a proud expression appeared on his face. Of course there isn't any danger if you follow me. If you follow someone else, then it might not be so. Previously, when we were outside the imperial mausoleum, it was just a smoke screen. There are at least 5 times more traps inside than outside. Yili wiped the non-existent sweat from her forehead. Master, your disciple feels like we've fallen into a trap. What would have happened if I hadn't come in with you? Dr. Lin's lips twitched without a trace of a smile. The traps at the exit aren't any less than inside. Also, the map to decipher the traps is placed together with the treasure. You know so well, Yili muttered in a low voice. The mausoleum was silent, so Dr. Lin naturally heard Yili's voice clearly. He smiled proudly and said, This mausoleum was designed and built by our ancestors. Do you think there's anyone in this world who knows it better than me? Yili raised her eyebrows and followed closely behind Dr. Lin. After entering the imperial mausoleum, Yili finally understood what an imperial mausoleum was. No one knew what the inside of Emperor Qin's mausoleum was like. In her previous life, Yili had seen many imperial mausoleums that had been plundered or excavated by grave robbers. They could only be considered historical remains. Yili remembered that the historical records had once recorded the Emperor Qin's mausoleum. Through the 3 springs, copper was poured into the coffin. The palace was filled with hundreds of officials, strange objects. Mercury was used as the rivers and the seas, and the mechanics were imbued. Astronomy above, geography below. Mermaid paste was used as a candle to help those who were not extinguished for a long time. She didn't know if this mausoleum was as grand and magnificent as the Emperor Qin's mausoleum, but the scene in front of her was enough to prove that it was at least comparable to the Emperor Qin's mausoleum. The marble floor and walls were exquisitely carved, and lines of mercury and stars were densely packed in the astonishingly large mausoleum. She raised her head to look at the stars in the sky, which were all illuminated by various luminous pearls. The funerary objects in the mausoleum weren't bronze objects, but all kinds of exquisite gold, jade, and precious stones. The mausoleum was surrounded by lamps. In addition to the countless treasures in the mausoleum, the entire mausoleum was as bright as day. Looking at the dazzling mausoleum in front of her, which looked just like a miniature version of the imperial city, Yili couldn't help but pay attention to the few short sentences in the historical records. Were ancient imperial mausoleums so similar regardless of time and space? An extremely strange feeling arose in her heart. However, when she saw Dr. Lin's excited and admiring expression, Yili decided not to say anything. "Master, do you want to go in?" Yili couldn't help but ask. Dr. Lin came back to his senses and put away the expression on his face. He reluctantly looked at the white building in front of him and nodded. The two of them stood at the entrance of the palace in a daze. The gate of the palace was shut tight. There was no lock or anything else. There was only a piece of black jade engraved with words, surrounded by coiling dragons. The two of them looked at it carefully. There were a few simple words arranged without any pattern, but these words were moving. It was clear that they needed someone to rearrange them. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at the words in front of her. Sweep He Lu Jun Xia Hing Lin Tian. It was a very simple 8-character game. When put together, it should be Sweep 6, Lord descends under the heavens. Seeing Dr. Lin move the words on the door, Yili frowned slightly. She didn't know why, but she felt a sense of unease. However, after looking at it carefully for a long time, she still couldn't figure out what the problem was. Yili could only stand to the side and carefully look at Dr. Lin. Suddenly, Yili seemed to see the words on the side of the door twist strangely. Yili blinked, trying to determine if she was hallucinating or if she really saw something. She carefully looked at the word Tian and finally found that the bottom part of the word Tian was a little crooked for some reason. Moreover, if she looked carefully, she would find that something was slowly squirming. Yili's mind raced. Something quickly flashed through her mind. She didn't have time to think carefully. She stretched out her hand and pulled Dr. Lin, who was lowering his head and moving the words, away. "Aye." Dr. Lin cried out in alarm. He didn't need Yili to pull him back. He looked at his fingers in shock. 2 of his fingers were stuck with some strange black things that were slowly squirming. His fingers were also being corroded at an extremely fast speed. Dr. Lin's expression changed greatly. Yili didn't have time to think carefully. She grabbed Dr. Lin's hand and slashed the sharp dagger in her hand. The skin and part of the corroded flesh on Dr. Lin's 2 fingers were cut off and fell to the ground. Then the 2 of them were shocked to find that the rotten flesh on the ground was actually continuing to corrode the white jade foundation on the ground. They both turned to look at the door. The image on the door was gradually becoming blurry. More and more black things were squirming on it as if they were about to break free. Yili pulled Dr. Lin back 2 steps and said, "Master, we're in big trouble. Let's go." Dr. Lin looked at his right hand that was still bleeding. His expression was very ugly. The secret ancestral records didn't mention this. Yili said, "It's clear that the ancestor of the previous dynasty tricked you. What is that thing?" The 2 of them quickly walked down the steps of the palace. But it was clear that the owner of the tomb didn't plan on letting the intruders off so easily. The piers that were originally built on the surface of the Mercury River for people to cross suddenly sank to the bottom of the water. Yili even heard cracking sounds in many places. It was clearly the sound of some mechanisms being activated. Not to mention that none of them could jump over the Mercury River. Even if they could, the following mechanisms and hidden weapons wouldn't be easy to deal with. The designer of the tomb definitely wouldn't have not considered the possibility that the intruders could be a martial arts expert. The 2 of them turned back to look at the door. The black things were already beginning to grow bigger. The writing from before couldn't be seen at all. Some of them had already separated from the body and were flying out like small insects. The 2 of them had seen the power of those small insects. Dr. Lin only touched a little bit and 2 of his fingers were corroded. There was also a hole the size of a wine cup in the white jade foundation. If they touched their bodies, not only would the 2 of them die, they would die very miserably. "What is this thing?" Dr. Lin frowned. Although his family was no longer involved in matters related to tombs, there were still many records in the family. But he was certain that he had never seen this kind of thing before. Yili pulled Dr. Lin. While looking for a place to retreat, she vigilantly stared at the black fog not far away. "Master knows about awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus, right?" Dr. Lin didn't understand. Awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus? What does this have to do with awe-inspiring caterpillar fungus? Yili said, "It's a worm in the winter and a grass in the summer. This is the same. When it's warm, it's a worm. When it's cold, it's like jade." When Master moved the words, the temperature of his fingers made these small things come alive. "Does Master have a way?" Dr. Lin was helpless. I've never even seen this damn thing before. What can I do? Yili said, then it's troublesome. If these small things fly everywhere, not only will we be unlucky, but all the treasures in this tomb will also suffer. Chapter 391. Do you still have time to think about these things right now? Dr. Lin glared at her and said in a bad mood. Yili said with a faint smile, just because I don't think about it doesn't mean other people won't? Dr. Lin was stunned. What other people? As soon as his voice fell, a black shadow flew up from the other side. There were several whooshing sounds as several sharp arrows flew towards the black shadow in the air. The black-clothed person jumped into the air and narrowly dodged the arrows in the air. A row of giant nails came down from above his head. The black-clothed person who didn't have time to land in the air could only flip around and dodge the nails with difficulty. There was a tearing sound as his clothes were torn a little. Only then did she see the black-clothed person land in a sorry state. He swayed on the ground before steadying himself. Yili's hand was like lightning and the dagger in her hand flashed with a cold light. The black-clothed person had just steadied himself when the cold dagger was pressed against his back. Don't move. If I was too heavy, I might not take your life, but I'm afraid you will be bedridden for the rest of your life. The black-clothed person slightly tilted his head. Princess Ding? So you're still alive? Yili smiled. So it's an acquaintance? But there doesn't seem to be anyone like you among the people this Fae knows. The man raised his hand and threw the weapon in his hand to the ground, saying, Wang Fei, don't be nervous. I won't hurt you and I definitely won't let you die. At least, I definitely won't let you die here. Yili gave a beautiful smile. I am very moved. But before you come you should first tell me who you are. Otherwise, I can't guarantee that you won't die here. Saying this, Yili held the dagger in one hand and the man in the other. She turned him to face Dr. Lin and asked with a smile, Master, do you know him? Dr. Lin looked at the black-clothed man with a complicated expression. After a long time he gave a long sigh and said, You still came in the end. The man said matter-of-factly, I just came to take back what belongs to me. What's wrong with that? Yili tilted her head to look at the two people. She smiled and said, I'm more and more curious about who you are. The man smiled and said, Why don't you come to the front and take a look yourself? The tomb was quiet. Yili glanced over the shoulder of the man in black and saw Dr. Lin standing opposite her with a tense expression. After a moment of silence, she suddenly chuckled and took the initiative to let go of the dagger against the man in black and took a few steps back. Seeing Dr. Lin's surprised expression, Yili smiled and said, It's just a joke. Now that we're in the same boat, if we make a fuss we might not be able to leave. The black-clothed man adjusted himself slightly, lowered his head and laughed softly. He said in a deep voice, Everyone says that Princess Ding is extremely intelligent, but I didn't believe it at first. But now it seems that the rumors are true. No wonder Prince Ding is willing to. At the mention of Mo Xiuyao, Yili's heart tightened. She hadn't heard any news about Mo Xiuyao in a long time. Thinking about his health and the environment he was in, she couldn't help but worry. But at this time she would not reveal any of her thoughts in front of this man who she didn't know anything about. She looked calmly at the man in black whose back was facing her and said coolly, It seems that this Fae and sire know each other. Since this is the case, why don't we meet in person? The black-clothed man didn't say much and turned to face Yili. According to Yili's understanding, Lin Yuan should be in his early 30s, but the man in front of her looked no more than 26 or 27. The black robes made his figure appear even thinner and taller. At the same time, it made his handsome face appear even more sinister and cold. It was just a glance, but it gave people a very uncomfortable feeling. Yili frowned slightly. Looking at Yili's expression, the man did not mind. His gaze stopped at Yili's stomach that was not small anymore. He smiled and said, This one greets Princess Ding. Yili stared at him for a beat before calmly calling out his name, Tan. The black-clothed man looked at Yili. His sinister smile seemed to become more joyful. I hadn't thought that Wang Fei would remember such a small person like this one. This one is really fortunate. This one is Tan Jiji. Wang Fei can call me Lin Yuan. Yili snorted softly and said faintly, Tan Darren, now does not seem to be the time to reminisce. If you don't think of a way, you and I can sleep here forever. Towards Yili's clear disdain, Tan Jiji did not care. He said calmly, Wang Fei is right. Finishing, he turned to look at the growing black mist at the door. They could only rejoice that these things seemed to like to gather together and not fly around by themselves. Otherwise, they would be in even greater trouble. Tan Jiji turned his head to look at Yi Li and asked, "Since Wang Fei has some understanding of these things, do you have a way to deal with them?" Yi Li also understood that this was not the time to bargain. She said faintly, "These things become insects when they are hot and jade when they are cold. Tandaran does not need this Fei to say more, right?" Tan Jiji rubbed his chin and said in a low voice, "Cold. I understand. Wang Fei, please wait a moment." Finishing, Tan Jiji rose into the air again and flew towards the other side. It was clear that he wanted to find something. At the same time, he was met with an endless barrage of hidden weapons and sharp arrows. Fortunately, Tan Jiji seemed to have a good understanding of this tomb. Even though he was in a sorry state, he was not injured. Chapter 392. Dr. Lin lowered his head, silently agreeing with Yi Li's words. He had raised Lin Yuan until he was nearly 20 years old, so he naturally understood his thoughts. In Lin Yuan's eyes, his adoptive father might not be as valuable as Yi Li, the Dingguo Wang Fei. While the two were talking, Tan Jiji had already returned. His qinggong was obviously not bad, at least after dodging more than 10 waves of hidden weapons and arrows, he was still able to move with ease. He glanced at Yi Li standing in the corner by the Quicksilver River. He no longer hesitated and rushed towards the black fog that was about to enter space and time. Huh. What is that? Yi Li looked in the distance with some surprise. A thick layer of white ice crystals wrapped around the black fog. Although it still tried to struggle, Tan Jiji held a bag of water in his hand and kept pouring it on the ice crystals, making the white ice crystals thicker and thicker. Gradually, the black fog was completely wrapped inside. Dr. Lin's face was a little ugly. He coldly said, "Snow Jade Pearl." Yi Li was at a loss. When she was young, under the guidance of the Su family and the Su family, she had a certain foundation in appraising treasures and antiques. But she had never heard of this Snow Jade Pearl. Dr. Lin coldly said, "Its other name is Corpse-Raising Pearl. As long as it is placed in the mouth of the deceased will quickly be wrapped in a layer of ice crystals and will not rot for 100 years. He moved the bodies of the concubines who were buried with him. Yi Li uncomfortably rubbed her cheeks. She smiled apologetically to Dr. Lin and said, "Master, this is an urgent matter. This tomb was at least 500 years old. Something taken out from the mouth of a 500-year-old corpse." Even Yi Li's smile was a little stiff. However, if that was the only way to solve the current situation, Yi Li could only apologize to the concubines who were buried with him. After all, no one knew what the black fog would become in the end. Looking at the constantly expanding appearance, Yi Li did not doubt that it would completely corrode half of the tomb, including them who could not escape. Seeing that the other side was almost finished, the two walked back. Tan Jiji looked at the two with a smile and said to Dr. Lin, "Father, all the mechanisms in the tomb have been activated. If we want to get out of here safely, we have to solve all the puzzles and treasures left behind by our ancestors." Dr. Lin said with a cold face, "Young master, this old man doesn't deserve to be called father. I also don't know about any riddles or treasures. Since young master is the owner of the Imperial Mausoleum, you can do whatever you want." Tan Jiji's face darkened slightly as he said indifferently, "Father, why do you have to be angry with me? What I've done has always been the wishes of our ancestors, hasn't it? It's fine if father doesn't support me, but why does he keep making things difficult for me?" Dr. Lin's face twisted as he turned around and stopped talking. Tan Jiji didn't care. He looked sideways at Yi Li and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, this tomb is full of traps. Can this one believe that Wang Fei won't make trouble?" Yi Li gently stroked her belly and smiled gently. "Official Tan can rest assured. Even if this consort doesn't care about her own life, she still has to take care of the child in her belly." Tan Jiji nodded with satisfaction and said, "Very good. This one also doesn't want to hurt Wang Fei and the little heir. I also don't want to become enemies with His Highness Prince Ding." After receiving Yi Li's promise, Tan Jiji didn't have to worry about anything else. He walked forward and bent over to examine the palace's large door. The black insect fog from before had caused quite a bit of damage to the white jade door. The originally snow-white door was now covered with black spots and holes. Yi Li looked at the ice crystal ball that had rolled to the side. There was still a black jade-like object that could be seen clearly. The puzzle on the door was still there. Under the strange black jade there was another layer of jasper. This time, Tanjiji had clearly learned his lesson from Dr. Lin. He didn't use his finger to touch the surface of the jasper. Instead he took out a dagger and slowly moved the words on the surface. The puzzle of 8 words wasn't difficult to begin with. After a short while Tanjiji finished it. With 2 cracking sounds the jasper split in 2 and fell to the ground. What was revealed was a strange keyhole. The white jade door didn't have a lock. It was just a round keyhole. Tanjiji turned to look at Dr. Lin and said, "Father, please give me the key." Dr. Lin calmly and indifferently looked at him. "I don't have the key." Tanjiji frowned. His malicious face clearly showed his displeasure. Of course he didn't believe that Dr. Lin didn't have the key. If one asked who in this world knew the most about this tomb other than himself, then it would undoubtedly be his foster father who had raised him since he was young. Because everything he knew had been told to him by his foster father since he was young. "Perhaps I can try?" Seeing Tanjiji's increasingly gloomy face, Yili suddenly spoke. The 2 people facing each other were stunned. They both looked at Yili. Tanjiji's gaze was filled with surprise and suspicion. Dr. Lin's gaze was filled with doubt and worry. Yili slowly walked forward. She lowered her head to observe the keyhole for a while. She lowered her head and laughed. Picking locks was once a necessary skill. Not to mention the previous one. Yili suddenly felt a little curious about the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty. She raised her hand and took out a simple copper hairpin from her hair. Yili casually fiddled with the keyhole. The 2 people behind her looked at the woman in front of them with a strange expression. If Princess Ding's knowledge of civil and martial arts didn't count as anything, then the fact that she could pick locks was very strange. Looking at her familiar appearance, Tanjiji felt that even if there were many godly thieves in the Jianghu, they wouldn't be as good as the woman in front of him. At least in order to enter this tomb he had specially studied many mechanisms and locks. However, the one in front of him clearly made him confused. After about 15 minutes there was a kachik sound from inside. Yili pulled out the copper hairpin and took a step back. The white jade door made a caw-caw sound. A moment later, under the gaze of the 3 people, it slowly retreated to the side. The center of the imperial tomb was revealed in front of the 3 people. Inside was a grand hall. It was clearly built to imitate the main hall of the imperial palace. The altar lamp in the hall was still quietly burning. The grand hall was dazzling with gold and jade. It made people feel as if they were truly in an imperial palace and not in a gloomy ancient tomb. His gaze swept around the hall, but he didn't see the coffin of the previous dynasty's ancestor, which he originally thought should be in the hall. There was only a sandalwood box on the imperial table in the hall, and a portrait of the emperor in court robes hung in front of it. It was clearly the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty. Tanjiji was stunned. He couldn't help but kneel in front of the portrait and respectfully kowtow a few times. Yili raised her eyebrows and looked at Dr. Lin, who had a deep frown. He clearly didn't have any intention of kneeling to the previous emperor. After Tanjiji finished kneeling to the ancestor, he stood up. He looked at Yili and said, "Princess Ding, this is my ancestor, the founding ancestor of the previous dynasty." His words were filled with admiration and yearning for his ancestor. His tone towards Yili also contained a bit of flaunting and self-satisfaction. Yili gave him face and nodded. She smiled and said, "Congratulations, I've heard a lot about you." Tanjiji clearly didn't care about her perfunctory words. He quickly walked into the hall and stared in a daze at the large sandalwood box on the imperial table. He carefully held his breath. Clearly this was the treasure he had been searching for. Yili stared at the sandalwood box with great interest. She was really curious about what kind of treasure could compare to the mountains of gold, silver, jewels, jade and antiques outside.